Hey everyone, and welcome back to Conspiracy Theory Declassified. Tonight, we're peeling back the layers on a story that feels ripped from a Cold War spy thriller, but for 269 souls, it was a terrifying and final reality. We're talking about Korean Airlines Flight 007, a passenger jet that vanished from radar screens after being shot down by a Soviet fighter jet. The world was told it was a tragic accident, a simple navigational error, but was it? Or was this jumbo jet filled with civilians a pawn in a much deadlier game? Before we dive into the mystery, if you're as fascinated by the unknown as I am, please hit that like and subscribe button. It helps us find more stories that deserve to be told. And while you're at it, drop a comment below with a mystery you think is due for a new look. We read every single one. All right, turn down the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin our investigation. The date is August 31st, 1983. You find yourself in the polished, sterile environment of Anchorage International Airport in Alaska. It's late, well past 3 a.m. local time, and the air outside carries the sharp, clean bite of the subarctic. Through the vast terminal windows, you see the behemoth resting on the tarmac, bathed in the yellow glow of the airport lights. It's a Boeing 747-200, the undisputed queen of the skies. Its iconic hump and massive wingspan project an aura of safety, of technological mastery. This is Korean Airlines Flight 07. For the passengers boarding, this is just a layover, a necessary pause on a grueling journey from New York City to Seoul, South Korea. You watch them as they file down the jet bridge, a microcosm of the world. There are families returning home, children drowsy and irritable in their parents' arms. There are business travelers, minds already on the meetings that await them in Seoul. There are tourists, clutching souvenirs from their American adventure. Among them, though you wouldn't know it at the time, is a sitting United States Congressman, Larry McDonald of Georgia, a staunch anti-communist heading to a treaty celebration. For everyone here, this is the final leg. Just a 6.5-hour flight over the dark expanse of the North Pacific, and they'll be home. You follow them onto the plane. The cabin is a familiar scene of controlled chaos. The rustle of jackets being stored in overhead bins, the polite murmurs of "excuse me," the soft click of seatbelts. The flight attendants, immaculate in their uniforms, move through the aisles with practiced efficiency, offering reassuring smiles. The mood is one of weary routine. This is just another flight, one of thousands that trace the globe every single day. Now let's move forward, past the passenger cabin, through the galley and to the door at the front. You slip through it and you're in the cockpit. Here, the atmosphere is different. It's a space of calm, focused professionalism. In the captain's seat sits Chun Byung-in, a man who is the very picture of competence. He's not some rookie. He's a veteran with over 10,000 hours of flight time, a significant portion of that in the 747. He's a former fighter pilot for the South Korean Air Force, a man who understands military airspace and the unforgiving nature of the sky. He is, by all accounts, one of CAL's most senior and respected pilots. His co-pilot and flight engineer are similarly experienced. This is a top-tier crew. Before you, the instrument panel glows with a dizzying array of dials, switches, and screens. At the heart of it all is the navigation system, the Inertial Navigation System, or INS. This was the pinnacle of 1980s aviation technology. It's not like today's GPS that constantly updates from satellites. The INS is a self-contained marvel of gyroscopes and accelerometers. You have to tell it where it is and where it's going. The crew punches in the coordinates for the flight path, a route designated as Romeo 20. It's the northernmost of 5 airways that stretch from Alaska to East Asia, a corridor in the sky designed to keep planes safely in international airspace, well clear of the tense, heavily militarized border of the Soviet Union. The process is meticulous. There are 3 separate INS units. The coordinates for each waypoint on the long journey must be entered into each one. It's a system built on redundancy. One mistake on one unit, the other 2 will flag it. It would take a series of identical, unlikely errors for the plane's primary navigation to be compromised. You watch as the crew completes their pre-flight checks. Everything appears normal. The flight plan is loaded, the systems are green. At 4 a.m. Alaskan Standard Time, the engines spool up with a deafening roar. The giant aircraft trundles to the runway. pauses for a moment as if taking a final breath, and then hurtles into the inky blackness. You feel the powerful push as it climbs, banking gently to the southwest. Below, the lights of Anchorage shrink and then disappear, swallowed by the vast unlit wilderness of the Alaskan coast and the cold, dark waters of the Pacific Ocean. Inside the cabin, the lights dim. Blankets are unfurled. Pillows are fluffed. The gentle hum of the engines is a lullaby. And soon, most of the 269 souls on board are asleep, secure in the belief that they are on the right path, in the safest of hands. They are completely unaware that they are already and have been from the moment they left the ground, flying to their doom. Here we encounter our first established fact. Korean Airlines Flight 007 departed Anchorage, Alaska, with 269 people on board, intending to fly Airway Romeo 20 to Seoul. But here, too, is our first lesser-known detail, a piece of information that sits uneasily with the official story to come. The crew, led by a highly experienced former military pilot, was not just flying with a single navigation system, but a triple redundant INS. The official explanation will eventually blame a simple 10-degree longitude error in programming, a single wrong number. But for this mistake to go unnoticed, it would have to have been made identically across multiple systems, or the crew would have had to ignore multiple warning flags and cross-checks. A level of professional negligence from a veteran crew that strains credulity. And this brings us to our first critical question of the night. How does a state-of-the-art aircraft flown by a seasoned crew with thousands of hours of experience commit a navigational blunder so basic and so profound that it goes completely unnoticed for hours, steering them hundreds of miles off course into the most hostile and forbidden airspace on the planet? The massive 747 continues its ascent, a solitary point of light against an endless canvas of stars. Inside, the world has shrunk to the dimensions of the fuselage, a climate-controlled sanctuary cruising at 35,000 feet. The journey is supposed to be simple, a predictable arc across the globe. You're flying the Romeo 20 Airway, an invisible highway in the sky meticulously mapped out for one primary reason: safety. To your north, just over the horizon, lies one of the most heavily fortified and secretive regions on Earth, the far eastern territory of the Soviet Union. The Kamchatka Peninsula and the Kuril Islands are a hornet's nest of military installations, early warning radar stations, air bases teeming with interceptor jets, and secretive naval facilities for the Soviet Pacific Fleet. Romeo 20 is the buffer zone, a demilitarized zone of the sky that keeps the routine commerce of the world at a safe distance from the hair-trigger tensions of the Cold War. In the cockpit, the autopilot is engaged. The complex machine is flying itself. The crew's job now is to monitor the systems, to communicate with air traffic control, and to be ready for any anomaly. They are flying blind in the darkness, putting their faith entirely in the glowing numbers of their inertial navigation system. The first major waypoint after departure is a navigational fix named Bethel, over 400 miles away. Reaching Bethel would require a distinct turn to the southwest, bending the flight path down and away from Soviet territory. It's a fundamental, unmissable part of the flight plan. But the turn never happens. You are there, a silent observer in the cockpit. You see the instruments. The autopilot indicator shows it's in INS mode, meaning it should be following the pre-programmed route. The needles on the horizontal situation indicator, which shows the plane's position relative to its course, are perfectly centered. According to every primary display in front of the pilots, the plane is exactly where it should be. They are flying a perfect flight, but it's the wrong flight. Instead of heading for Bethel, the aircraft is maintaining the same steady heading it took on departure. It's flying a rum line, a straight line on a flat map, that is slowly but surely diverging from the curved Great Circle route of Romeo 20. The deviation begins subtly. 10 minutes into the flight, you're just a couple of miles north of where you should be. 20 minutes, the gap has widened to over 6 miles. An hour passes. Now, you are more than 50 miles off course, flying in parallel to your intended route, but in a corridor of sky that is dangerously closer to the Soviet Union. Down on the ground in Anchorage, air traffic controllers watch the green blip of Cal 007 move across their screens. They see it for about 150 miles, and everything looks fine. Then, it passes the limit of their primary radar coverage. From this point on, they, like the crew, are relying on faith. Faith that the pilots will follow the flight plan and accurately report their position. And the pilots do report their position. As they pass the point where the waypoint Bethel should have been, Captain Chun keys his microphone and radios in, his voice calm and routine, stating that they are passing Bethel, on time and on course. It's a phantom report. They are nowhere near Bethel. They are, at this moment, about 100 miles north of it, flying directly toward the coast of Kamchatka. How is this possible? The official story will settle on a simple, almost embarrassingly basic mistake. The theory is that the crew either failed to engage the INS navigation mode after takeoff, leaving the autopilot to follow a simple magnetic heading, or they made a catastrophic error when inputting their own starting position on the tarmac in Anchorage, telling the computers the plane was starting from a point thousands of miles away. This is our established fact. For over 5 hours, the crew of Cal 007 consistently reported being on course at their designated waypoints, while their aircraft was in fact flying a completely different route, deviating by over 300 miles into prohibited Soviet airspace. The discrepancy between their reported positions and their actual position was enormous, yet they never once indicated a problem. But this is where you encounter a detail that doesn't quite fit the narrative of a simple, clumsy error. The deviation wasn't a sloppy drift. It was a mathematically precise track. The plane maintained its erroneous heading with unwavering accuracy for hours. This has led some investigators to a much more chilling hypothesis: the theory of a phantom waypoint. This fringe theory suggests that the course wasn't an accident at all. It was programmed. The idea is that the INS was intentionally fed a different set of coordinates, guiding the plane not along Romeo 20, but on a clandestine route designed for another purpose. It was a perfect line, just the wrong one. Could such a complex deception be programmed without the crew noticing? Or was the crew complicit? The idea seems outlandish, but it provides a disturbing explanation for the flight path's precision that the forgotten switch theory struggles to account for. Back in the cabin, the passengers sleep. Some might stir, looking out the window into the void, seeing nothing but the flashing strobe on the wingtip against a sea of black. They are blissfully unaware of the invisible line they are about to cross, the line between international and sovereign airspace, the line between a routine flight and a geopolitical incident, the line between life and death. The silent deviation continues, the gap growing with every passing minute. 200 miles off course, 250. The plane, a symbol of international connection and commerce, has become a ghost, a silent intruder flying ever deeper into the dragon's lair. This forces us to ask a question that cuts to the very heart of this mystery, a question that is deeply unsettling for anyone who has ever stepped onto an airplane and put their trust in the crew. Why did 3 experienced pilots, with a professional duty to cross-check their instruments and maintain situational awareness, apparently fail to notice a massive sustained navigational error for over 5 hours, even as their actual position became hundreds of miles different from their reported one? Were they truly that oblivious, or were they seeing exactly what they expected to see? As your phantom aircraft, Korean Airlines Flight 007, serenely cruises through the pre-dawn blackness, it is closing in on a frontier more significant than any line on a map. This is the Air Defense Identification Zone, the ADIZ of the Soviet Union. You can't see it, feel it, or hear it, but you are about to cross it. This invisible boundary is a tripwire. To the Soviets guarding this remote corner of their empire, anything crossing that line unannounced is not a lost tourist. It's a threat. This region, the Kamchatka Peninsula, is one of the most sensitive military jewels of the entire USSR. It is home to nuclear submarine bases, top-secret radar installations, and most importantly, a major testing ground for their intercontinental ballistic missiles. The electronic ether here is thick with secrets, and the United States military wants desperately to hear them, which is why on this very night another aircraft is prowling the edges of this forbidden zone. It's a different beast entirely. It's not a passenger plane, it's a hunter. You are now aboard a USAF RC-135, specifically a variant known as a Cobra Ball. From the outside, it bears a passing resemblance to a Boeing 707, but its purpose is radically different. This plane is an ear, a massive flying vacuum cleaner for electronic signals. Its fuselage is bristling with specialized antennas, and its insides are crammed with sophisticated listening gear and analysts whose job is to eavesdrop on the enemy. Their mission tonight is routine, if incredibly tense. Fly a specific, pre-planned racetrack pattern in international airspace, just outside the Soviet ADIs. And listen, they are waiting for the Soviets to test a new missile, hoping to capture the telemetry data, the electronic lifeblood of the missile's flight, to analyze its capabilities. Imagine a radar screen at a Soviet air defense station in Kamchatka. It's the middle of the night watch, a tedious and monotonous duty. But then, a blip appears. The operator recognizes its general flight path. It's the American spy plane. They've seen it before. It flies its predictable pattern, a recurring annoyance, and they track it meticulously. For a couple of hours, the RC-135 does its job, skating along the edge of Soviet airspace. Its crew gathers whatever intelligence they can, and then, their mission complete, they turn for home, heading back east towards their base in Alaska. The Soviet radar operator watches the blip turn and begin to recede. The threat is diminishing. But then, something strange happens. As the RC-135's radar signature fades, another one appears. It emerges from the same general area of the sky where the American spy plane had been loitering. But this target doesn't turn away. This target does the unthinkable. It maintains its course and speed and flies directly towards Kamchatka. It crosses the line. The tripwire is broken. To the Soviet operator squinting at his green phosphorus screen, the situation is dangerously ambiguous. Did the spy plane turn back, and this is a second, unknown aircraft? Or is it a trick? Did the American plane perform some kind of maneuver and is now making a direct, provocative incursion into their sovereign territory? The context of the preceding hours has poisoned their perception. They were already watching a spy plane. Now, an intruder appears from the same patch of sky. This convergence is the established, undeniable fact of the matter. A U.S. Air Force RC-135 reconnaissance plane was on station and was tracked by Soviet radar in the same time frame and general vicinity that Cal 007 made its approach to Soviet airspace. The Soviets would later claim, in their initial justifications for the shootdown, that they thought they were chasing this very spy plane. Yet this is where the official story of mistaken identity begins to fray, giving rise to a far more sinister, lesser-known theory, the idea of a deliberate swap. This fringe theory posits that the proximity of the two aircraft was no coincidence. In this version of events, the RC-135 was not just a passive collector of information, it was bait. The theory suggests a possible electronic warfare gambit where the two planes, one military and one civilian, coordinated their movements. For a brief period, they might have flown close enough to merge into a single radar contact only to separate again, leaving the Soviets to track the wrong target, the civilian airliner. An even more extreme version suggests a transponder swap, where the planes electronically traded identities, a technological feat that would imply a staggering level of coordination and a cold-blooded willingness to sacrifice the passenger jet. You see the RC-135 not as a shadow but as a Judas goat, leading the unsuspecting lamb to the slaughter to see how the wolves will react. The crew of the RC-135 would later be interviewed and would state that they were unaware of any civilian airliner in their vicinity. They saw nothing on their radar. They flew their mission and went home. But the seeds of doubt were sown. The presence of that spy plane provides the single most critical element for the conspiracy narrative: a plausible motive. Without the RC-135, the flight of Cal 007 over Soviet territory is a pointless tragedy. With the RC-135, it potentially becomes a mission. Cal 007 becomes the ultimate passive surveillance tool, a Trojan horse designed to make the Soviets turn on all their radars, activate all their defense systems, and broadcast all their secrets for the listening ear of the RC-135 and other U.S. intelligence assets. As the RC-135 flies safely back to Alaska, its crew unaware of the chaos they are leaving in their wake, Cal 007 continues its lonely journey. It is no longer just a lost plane. In the minds of the men on the ground in Kamchatka, It is a hostile intruder, an American aggressor. The ambiguity is gone, replaced by a sense of certainty, however mistaken. The alarms are now blaring across the air defense network. The silent deviation is about to get very, very loud. Which leads us to a pivotal question that challenges the simple mistake theory. Considering the Soviets were already on high alert, actively tracking a known US spy plane just off their coast, is it truly believable that their sophisticated air defense network simply couldn't tell the difference between the radar profile of a military RC-135 and a massive Boeing 747? Or was the convergence of these two aircraft at this precise time and place a deliberately engineered event designed to provoke a reaction? The tripwire has snapped. Deep within the hardened command bunkers of the Soviet air defense forces on the Kamchatka Peninsula, the atmosphere has become electric with tension. You are there, in a dimly lit room that smells of stale cigarette smoke and ozone from the humming electronics. On a massive, sweeping radar display, the intruder is no longer a potential threat. It is a confirmed violation. The unidentified target, designated simply as Target 6268 by the operators, is flying a steady, unwavering course directly over their territory. Imagine the perspective of the commander on duty. For the last 2 hours, his sector was on alert, monitoring a known American spy plane, an RC-135, that was deliberately taunting his defenses just outside their airspace. That plane turned away, but now, this new target has appeared from the same direction and has done what the spy plane only threatened to do. It has crossed the line. The intruder's flight path is not erratic, like a lost civilian plane might be. It is a straight, deliberate line that takes it directly over the Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky Naval Base, the home of the Soviet Pacific Fleet's nuclear submarine force. In the paranoid calculus of the Cold War, this is no accident. This is a spy run. It's a ferret flight designed to probe their defenses, to trigger their radar systems, to map their electronic order of battle. The command goes out sharp and urgent: scramble the fighters. On an icy tarmac somewhere below, you hear the piercing shriek of a klaxon. Pilots, roused from a fitful sleep, sprint across the concrete towards the hardened shelters housing their machines. These are not just any aircraft. They are Sukhoi Su-15s and Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-23s. Aircraft built for one purpose and one purpose only: to climb at supersonic speeds, find an enemy in the sky, and destroy it. You feel the ground tremble as their engines ignite in a blast of orange flame, and within minutes 4 interceptors are clawing their way into the night sky, their afterburners tearing holes in the darkness. Now you're in the cockpit of one of those fighters. The world outside is a disorienting black void. Your only connection to reality is the voice of the ground control intercept operator crackling in your headset, feeding you vectors, altitude, speed, heading, to guide you toward the intruder. The GCI is your eyes, but tonight, your eyes are failing you. The instructions are confusing, contradictory: turn left, no, turn right, increase altitude, target is not visible. The interceptors burn precious fuel, streaking through empty sky. They are chasing a ghost. The massive 747, a plane that should be as easy to find on radar as a barn in a field, is proving infuriatingly elusive. The fighters make pass after pass but find nothing. This is our established fact. The initial Soviet intercept attempt over the Kamchatka Peninsula was a complete failure. 4 fighter jets were scrambled, but due to a combination of darkness, bad weather, and poor ground control, none were able to locate, identify, or engage the target before it passed out of their range and flew back into international airspace over the Sea of Okhotsk. The official explanation is simple Soviet incompetence. But here you find a lesser-known, more provocative theory: the possibility of electronic countermeasures, or ECM. This theory suggests that the reason the Soviet intercept was so chaotic was that their radar was being actively jammed. A lost passenger jet has no such capability, but a specially equipped military aircraft or even a civilian plane, modified for an intelligence mission, would. Was Cal-07 a true Trojan horse? Not just a passive lure, but an active combatant in an electronic war? This fringe idea provides a potential answer to a baffling question. How did one of the most sophisticated air defense networks in the world, on high alert for an intruder, fail so spectacularly to find a target as large as a 747 It suggests the intruder wasn't just wandering blindly. It was defending itself. Back in the Soviet command bunker, the mood has soured from tension to fury and embarrassment. The target has slipped through their grasp. It flew over their most vital military installations and escaped unscathed. The local commanders have failed. Reports are flying up the chain of command, all the way to Moscow, where the top brass of the Soviet military is being awakened with infuriating news. An American spy plane, for in their minds there is no longer any doubt, has just made a mockery of their multi-billion-ruble air defense shield. Meanwhile, Cal 007 continues its serene, silent flight. It has crossed Kamchatka. For the next hour, it soars over the international waters of the Sea of Okhotsk. Inside, the cabin remains quiet. A few passengers might be awake, perhaps stretching their legs, completely unaware that 4 fighter jets were just hunting them in the dark. For the crew in the cockpit, it's just another hour of routine flight, punctuated by another phantom position report radioed to air traffic control in Tokyo. They remain, by all appearances, oblivious, but their flight path hasn't changed. It's still a straight, unwavering line. And that line is now pointing directly at their next destination, Sakhalin Island, another piece of sovereign Soviet territory, another hornet's nest of military hardware. The Soviets have lost the first round, but they know exactly where the intruder is going. There will be a second round, and this time there will be no mistakes. This leaves us with a deeply troubling question regarding the Soviet response. Why did this supposedly impenetrable air defense system, designed to repel waves of nuclear-armed B-52 bombers, prove so utterly inept at intercepting a single non-maneuvering subsonic airliner on its first attempt? Was this a genuine case of systemic incompetence? Or was the target a far more sophisticated and elusive adversary than the world has been led to believe? The hour of reprieve is over. As Cal 007 flies over the cold, dark waters of the Sea of Okhotsk, it is charting a course for its final destination, Sakhalin Island. On the ground at Dolinsk Sokol Air Base, the mood is not one of confusion, but of grim determination. The failure over Kamchatka has echoed down the command structure, and the orders passed to this new sector are laced with an unspoken urgency. There will be no repeat of the earlier embarrassment. The intruder will be identified, and it will be stopped. You are on the flight line as another klaxon screams to life. A pilot, Major Gennady Osipovich, sprints to his aircraft. It is a Sukhoi Su-15, NATO codename Flagon. This is not a multi-role fighter. It is an interceptor, a machine honed to a razor's edge for a single task. It is a guided missile with a man inside, designed to rocket to high altitude, close with a target at twice the speed of sound, and obliterate it. Osipovich is a product of the same unforgiving system, a veteran pilot, disciplined, and trained to follow orders without question. When he climbs into his cockpit, he is not just a pilot, he is an instrument of the state's will. With a roar that shakes the very air, his Su-15 leaps from the runway. He is climbing on a pillar of fire, vectored by a new set of ground controllers who have had the luxury of time. They have been tracking the target for nearly an hour as it crossed the sea. They know its altitude, its speed, and its unyielding, predictable course. This time, the chase is not a wild guess. It is a mathematical certainty. You are in the cramped cockpit with Osipovich. The green, ghostly light of his radar scope is the only thing illuminating his face. He watches as the ground controllers guide him. Then, a bright, solid dot appears on his screen. "I have a lock," he radios. The target is his. He pushes the throttle forward, and the distance between hunter and prey begins to collapse with terrifying speed. He is approaching from behind, from the target's 6 o'clock position, the classic attack vector. He closes to within 2 kilometers, and then he sees it. Against the faintly lightening sky of the approaching dawn, he sees a silhouette. It is massive. This is no fighter jet. He reports to the ground, his voice a model of professional calm, but you can sense the underlying surprise. The target is large. This is the moment of truth, the point where all ambiguity should have vanished. What Osipovich sees in these crucial minutes will become one of the most fiercely debated aspects of this entire tragedy. The initial official Soviet account and Osipovich's own after-action report would be stark and clear. The aircraft was dark, flying without navigation or anti-collision lights, its shape consistent with an American military reconnaissance plane like a RC-135 or an E-3 AWACS. It was a hostile military target, an enemy. But years later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Osipovich himself would tell a very different story. In interviews, he would state, "I saw 2 rows of windows and knew that it was a Boeing. I knew this was a civilian plane." He would describe seeing the flashing strobe lights, the very lights designed to make a plane visible at night. He claimed he reported this to his commanders on the ground, telling them it was a civilian type of aircraft, albeit one being used for spying. This contradiction lies at the heart of the matter. For now, you are there, flying off the wing of the 747. You see the Su-15, a sleek shark of a jet, pull alongside the slumbering whale. Inside Cal 007, the passengers are still asleep. The crew perhaps is just beginning their pre-descent checklists as they anticipate their arrival in Seoul. Do they see the fighter jet shadowing them in the dark? The cockpit voice recorder will offer no clues. There is no sound of alarm, no indication they know they are being watched. This brings us to the established fact of this section. Major Gennady Osipovich, piloting in Su-15, successfully intercepted and flew in close formation with Cal 007 over Sakhalin Island for several minutes prior to the attack. He was in a position to visually identify the aircraft, but this is where we uncover a critical, lesser-known detail that undermines the entire mistaken identity defense. The Soviets' official stance and Osipovich's own initial report claimed the plane was flying lights out. This was a key justification for its hostile classification. However, the cockpit voice recorder tape, eventually released in 1992, contains audio of the Cal 007 crew discussing their own lights just minutes before the attack. This, combined with Osipovich's later recanted testimony, suggests that the lights-out claim was a deliberate falsehood, manufactured after the fact to create a justification for an act they knew was indefensible. The question then becomes, why lie if it was a simple mistake? Osipovich, the hunter, now has his prey in his sights. He has it visually identified. He is communicating with his commanders on the ground, who are themselves in contact with the highest levels of the Soviet military. The fate of the 269 people aboard the jumbo jet now hangs on the words that will come crackling back through his headset. He has the target. He is waiting for instructions. The calm, routine flight of Cal 007 is over. It is now a target. And so we must ask ourselves a critical question of perception and intent. How could a veteran fighter pilot flying just hundreds of meters from a Boeing 747, one of the most recognizable aircraft in the world, genuinely mistake its iconic hump, its 4 engines, and its double row of passenger windows for the profile of a military RC-135? Was this a failure of vision, a lie created under duress, or was he seeing exactly what his superiors wanted him to see? You are back in the cockpit of the Su-15, a predator locked onto its prey. Major Osipovich holds his position, a silent shadow off the wing of the colossal 747. The fate of everyone on board now rests on a tense, crackling conversation between him and his ground controller. According to all established international civil aviation law, the rules of the sky agreed upon by nations to prevent this exact kind of tragedy, the next steps should be clear and non-lethal. The protocol is to establish communication. You try to contact the intruding aircraft on the international emergency frequency, 121.5 megahertz. You fly ahead of the aircraft, rocking your wings, flashing your navigation lights in a prescribed pattern. Every signal is designed to be unmistakable, a universal language that says, "You are intercepted. Follow me." The use of force is an absolute last resort, reserved only for an aircraft that is confirmed as hostile and poses an imminent threat. But the sky over Sakhalin Island in 1983 is not governed by international civility. It is governed by the rigid, paranoid doctrine of the Soviet Air Defense Forces. An intruder that has penetrated 2 separate, highly sensitive military zones is not treated as a lost sheep to be guided home. It is treated as a cancer to be excised. The orders coming from the ground are not about communication. They are about control. The ground controller radios Osipovich, "Can you force it to land?" It's a question, but the subtext is clear. The plane cannot be allowed to simply fly away. This is where the story takes a sharp turn from a tense intercept to a disputed, almost farcical, series of alleged warnings. Osipovich would later claim, and the official Soviet narrative would insist, that he followed procedure. He tried to get the pilot's attention. He moved into a firing position and fired a series of warning shots from his powerful 23mm cannon. The audio transcripts of his exchange with the ground confirm the action. "I am firing cannon bursts." For a moment, this sounds like a clear, aggressive warning. A burst of cannon fire is hard to ignore. But here, the story collapses under the weight of a single, damning detail. Osipovich himself admitted he did not load his cannon with tracer rounds. Tracers are projectiles that contain a small pyrotechnic charge, burning brightly so their path is visible to the naked eye. They are specifically designed for aiming and for signaling. Instead, Osipovich fired over 200 rounds of armor-piercing shells with no tracer element. Imagine it. You are in the Cal 007 cockpit. A fighter jet you may not even see, flying in the dark a mile behind you, fires a stream of invisible bullets that pass harmlessly by. It's the equivalent of shouting a warning into a hurricane. It is a gesture completely devoid of meaning, a warning that cannot be perceived. The Soviets also claimed they attempted to raise Cal 007 on the radio, but there is no record of any such call on the airliner's cockpit voice recorder. There is no evidence they broadcast on the correct emergency frequency. On the CVR tape, the Cal pilots can be heard making routine conversation, completely untroubled. There is no hint of panic, no mention of radio calls or fighter jets outside their window. They are, to all appearances, utterly oblivious. And this is our established fact for this section. The internationally recognized standard procedures for intercepting a civilian airliner were not followed. No verifiable radio contact was made, and no standard visual signals were given. The only warning consisted of cannon fire that was likely invisible to the flight crew. This leads us to a crucial and lesser-known detail, a piece of the puzzle that points towards a premeditated act of destruction rather than a failed attempt to communicate. The choice to use non-tracer ammunition for the supposed warning shots. Why would a pilot, whose stated goal is to get another pilot's attention, deliberately use ammunition that could not be seen? Some military analysts suggest this wasn't a warning at all, but standard combat procedure, emptying the cannon to clear the guns before launching the primary armament, the missiles. In this light, the shots were not a signal to the 747's crew. They were a preparatory act for the kill, later repackaged for public consumption as a warning. While Osipovich is firing his invisible warnings, the clock is running out. The 747 is still on its steady course, now approaching the eastern coast of Sakhalin Island. Within minutes, it will cross back out over the sea and into international airspace. For the Soviet commanders on the ground, this is the final deadline. Letting the intruder escape a second time after it has been successfully intercepted is unthinkable. The humiliation would be immense. The orders coming from the ground grow more insistent, more final. The target is leaving our airspace. Engage the target. Use the missiles. In the cockpit of Cal 007, the pilots are having a calm, professional exchange with Tokyo Air Traffic Control. They request a climb to a higher altitude, flight level 350, to improve their fuel efficiency, the most routine of requests. Their world is one of fuel flows, airspeed, and arrival times. They have no idea that in another cockpit just a few thousand feet away, another pilot is selecting his weapons. The two realities, one mundane and one lethal, are about to collide. Osipovich receives his final command. It is not ambiguous. It is not a suggestion. It is an order. Destroy the target. The time for warnings, real or imagined, is over. The state has made its decision. Osipovich is now just the final link in the chain. This brings us to our challenging question, a question that cuts through the fog of Soviet excuses. If the true intention was to warn the intruding aircraft and force it to land, why would every single action taken, from the failure to use proper radio frequencies to the choice of invisible ammunition for warning shots, be the least effective method possible for achieving that goal? Or were these actions simply a perfunctory charade, a box-ticking exercise before carrying out the real order that had been inevitable from the start? The order is given. Destroy the target. In the cockpit of the Su-15, Major Osipovich's training takes over. There is no hesitation, no moment of reflection. There is only the mission. You are there as his gloved hand moves across the instrument panel, flipping the arming switches. A new, more menacing tone fills his headset, the sharp, insistent growl of his missile's seeker heads locking onto their target. The 4 massive engines of the Boeing 747, each one a bonfire of thermal energy, are painting an irresistible picture for the heat-seeking missile. The jumbo jet's enormous radar cross-section does the same for the other. He squeezes the trigger on his control stick. Once, then a second time. From under the wings of the Su-15, 2 streaks of light ignite the darkness. 2 R-98 air-to-air missiles, one guided by radar, the other by heat, leap from their pylons. For a fraction of a second, they seem to hang in the air before their rocket motors engage with a violent whoosh, accelerating them to over twice the speed of sound. They are death distilled into a few feet of metal and high explosives. They cover the mile-long distance to their target in less than 3 seconds. You are now in the passenger cabin of Cal 007. The gentle hum of the engines is a constant, reassuring presence. The cabin is dark, peaceful. A few reading lights are on. Most people are asleep, lost in dreams of home, of family, of the lives they will return to in just a few hours. And then the world ends. There is a blinding flash of white light, immediately followed by an explosion so violent it feels like the hand of God has slapped the aircraft out of the sky. It's not a simple bang. It's a deafening, shredding, tearing roar. The aircraft lurches violently, throwing sleeping passengers against their restraints. A wave of shrapnel from the proximity-fused warhead of the first missile rips through the rear of the fuselage. The second missile slams home, likely into the tail assembly. The sound is unimaginable. Instantly, the cabin depressurizes. The air, held at a comfortable sea-level pressure, erupts from the crippled fuselage into the thin, near vacuum of 35,000 feet. A hurricane of wind screams through the cabin, tearing at clothes, whipping debris, and sucking the very breath from your lungs. A thick, icy fog fills the air as the moisture instantly freezes. The oxygen masks drop from the ceiling, swaying violently. There is panic. Screams, the raw animal sound of pure terror in the pitch-black freezing chaos. In the cockpit, a symphony of alarms shrieks to life. The master warning panel lights up like a Christmas tree. The autopilot disconnects with a loud, repeating cavalry charge alarm. The pilots, Captain Chun and his first officer, are thrown from a state of routine monitoring into a desperate fight for survival. The explosion has likely severed or critically damaged the hydraulic lines in the tail, the very lines that power the control surfaces, the rudder, and the elevators that allow them to steer the gigantic plane. They are now wrestling with the controls of a 300-ton glider that is no longer fully under their command. From the cockpit voice recorder, you can hear their final desperate moments. You hear the alarms, the frantic breathing. You hear the captain, his voice strained with exertion and disbelief, shouting, "Rapid compression. Descend to 10,000. He mistakenly says compression instead of decompression, a common slip in a moment of extreme stress. They are trying to get the plane down to a breathable altitude, but the plane is already falling. For several seconds, the recording captures the sounds of their struggle, a battle against physics and a dying machine. And then, after just over a minute of chaos, the recorder goes silent. This is our established fact. At approximately 1826 UTC, Cal 007 was struck by at least one of 2 air-to-air missiles fired by Major Osipovich. The impact caused catastrophic damage and an explosive decompression, leading to an uncontrolled descent. From his vantage point, Osipovich watches the result of his work. He sees the flash of the impact, a brief, brilliant orange blossom in the dark. He radios his ground controller with 5 chillingly simple, detached words in Russian. Cel unichtozhena. The target is destroyed. His mission is complete. But this is where a crucial, lesser-known, and deeply haunting detail emerges. The plane was not, as the Soviets would long imply and many still believe, blown to pieces in a fiery explosion. The target was not destroyed in that moment. The CVR ran for over a minute after the impact, and Soviet and American radar tracked the aircraft for much, much longer. The crippled 747, with 269 souls on board, remained airborne, largely intact, for up to 12 minutes. 12 minutes. It entered a slow, phugoid cycle, a repeating pattern of nosing up, stalling, and then diving, as it spiraled down towards the sea. For 12 minutes, the passengers and crew were alive, conscious and aware as they fell from the sky in a dark, freezing, crippled machine. This horrifying detail changes everything. It transforms a sudden, merciful end into a prolonged period of unimaginable terror. It also opens up a host of questions. The fringe theories that bloom from this fact are profound. Could the pilots have regained some control? Could they have attempted a water landing? A ditching? The 12-minute descent is the single most important fact that fuels the persistent theories of survivors, a topic we will delve into much later. From the outside, you watch the ghost plane on its final, terrible journey. It traces a long, horrifying corkscrew pattern across the sky, falling towards the cold, black waters of the Sea of Japan, just west of Sakhalin Island. Then, after 12 minutes that must have felt like an eternity for those inside, the radar blip vanishes. The long fall is over. This leads us to a deeply disturbing question about the immediate aftermath and the narrative that was constructed around it. Why did the Soviet Union initially push the story that the plane was obliterated, effectively vaporized in the sky? What strategic purpose did it serve to hide the truth that the aircraft and its 269 occupants endured a terrifying 12-minute descent to their doom? The final violent impact sends a shockwave through the dark water, but on the surface of the world there is only silence. On the radar screens in Japan and at Soviet command posts on Sakhalin, the green blip that was Cal 007 simply vanishes. For Major Osipovich, flying high above, the engagement is over. He banks his Su-15 and heads for home, his duty done. For the 269 people who were aboard the airliner, their journey is over. But for the rest of the world, the mystery is just beginning. You find yourself now in the Japan Air Traffic Control Center in Tokyo. It's a place of calm, orderly procedure. The controllers are guiding dozens of aircraft through their sector. A few minutes ago, they were in routine communication with Cal 007, approving their request to climb to a higher altitude. Now, when they try to raise the flight, their calls are met with an unnerving, empty static. Korean Air 007, this is Tokyo Control, do you read? Silence. They try again. Cal 007, if you read, squawk ident, nothing. A single missed call is not unusual, but minutes stretch by. The plane is now overdue for its next check-in. The serene professionalism in the control center begins to fray at the edges, replaced by a growing knot of concern. An aircraft of that size with that many people doesn't just go quiet. Now shift your perspective thousands of miles away, to the arrivals hall at Gimpo International Airport in Seoul. The morning sun is streaming through the windows. The atmosphere is one of joyful anticipation. Families wait anxiously, holding welcome home signs and bouquets of flowers. Children, sleepy but excited, wait for their mothers or fathers. On the large flight information board, the entry for Ki-07 from New York reads on time. But the scheduled arrival time comes and goes. A ripple of confusion passes through the crowd. Then, the lettering on the board flickers and changes. The flight is now delayed. A collective sigh of frustration. An hour passes. The lettering changes again. Status unknown. The mood in the terminal shifts instantly. The smiles fade, replaced by expressions of confusion, then fear. Airline officials appear, their faces grim, trying to shepherd the families into a private room away from the growing number of news reporters who are beginning to sense a major story unfolding. The questions are frantic, desperate. Where is the plane? What have you heard? The officials have no answers, only silence. Within hours, the news is breaking across the globe. A Korean Airlines Boeing 747 with 269 people on board has vanished without a trace. There was no mayday call, no report of mechanical trouble, no hint of a problem. It simply disappeared from the sky. In newsrooms from London to New York, editors are scrambling. What could have happened? A catastrophic structural failure? A bomb in the luggage hold? A sudden violent storm? None of it makes sense. The weather was clear, the plane was one of the most reliable in the world, and a 747 is built with so much redundancy, It's almost impossible for it to simply fall out of the sky without the pilots having time to send a distress signal. Then the passenger manifest is released, and the story takes on a new politically charged dimension. Among the passengers is a sitting member of the United States Congress, Larry McDonald, a doctor and a fiercely anti-communist Democrat from Georgia, who was also the head of the ultra-conservative John Birch Society. His presence on the flight instantly ignites interest in Washington. The mystery of the missing plane is now an American political crisis. This is the established fact. In the initial hours and for nearly a full day after the plane's disappearance, its fate was a complete mystery to the public. The airline and governments could only confirm that the aircraft was missing, leading to a period of intense global speculation and anguish. But in the chaos of those first few hours, a very strange and often forgotten event occurred. A detail that conspiracy theorists have clung to for decades. In Seoul, as distraught families pleaded for information, Korean Airlines officials, for a brief period, told them that the plane was safe. They reported that KAL 007 had been forced to land on the Soviet island of Sakhalin, and that the passengers and crew were being cared for. This news, this glimmer of hope, was even broadcast by several major news networks before it was tragically and confusingly retracted. Where did this information come from? How could the airline make such a specific and ultimately baseless claim? Was it simply a catastrophic miscommunication? A desperate attempt to quell a panic born from wishful thinking? Or was it, as some fringe theories suggest, an unauthorized leak of the truth that the plane was forced down and not destroyed before the official narrative of a tragic accident could be set in stone? While the world was grappling with the mystery and families were being whipsawed between hope and despair, a handful of people already knew the terrible truth. In a drab, windowless building in Wakkanai, on the northernmost tip of Japan, military intelligence analysts were listening to a tape recording. They were from the Japan Self-Defense Forces, and their job was to monitor all Soviet military communications in the region. They had recorded everything. They had the frantic transmissions from the Soviet ground controllers. They had the calm, professional voice of Major Gennady Osipovich. They had the moment he locked his missiles, and they had the 5 chilling words: "The target is destroyed." They knew. The Americans at their own listening posts in the region also knew, but they didn't say anything. For hours, as the world searched for answers, the truth was held as a classified secret. This brings us to a crucial question about the politics of tragedy. Why did the American and Japanese governments, who possessed clear intelligence that the Soviets had shot down the airliner, withhold this information from the public and from South Korea for the better part of a day? What calculations were being made in those silent hours as a human tragedy was being transformed into a geopolitical weapon? While the world reels in confusion and families of the passengers of KAL 07 cling to the last vestiges of hope, the government of the Soviet Union wraps itself in a shroud of impenetrable silence. As the hours tick by, the plane AS' last known position becomes chillingly clear. It was on a direct course towards Soviet airspace. The first questions from international diplomats and news agencies directed at Moscow are met with a cold, dismissive wall. You are a journalist at a press briefing. You ask the question. The answer you receive is curt, absolute. We have no information on a missing Korean airliner. The Soviet Union has not been involved in any incident. It is a flat, total denial. For 2 full days, this is the unwavering official line from the Kremlin. They know nothing. They saw nothing. They did nothing. They even go so far as to suggest the Americans, who are now leading a search and rescue operation in the Sea of Japan, are conducting an illegal espionage mission under the guise of a rescue. It's a classic piece of Soviet misdirection known as whataboutism. Accuse your accuser of the very thing you are guilty of. They are not just denying the act, they are building a fortress of lies around it. But behind the scenes, the American and Japanese intelligence agencies are preparing a bombshell. They have the tapes, they have the irrefutable proof. The decision is made in Washington to go public. You are now at the United Nations Security Council in New York, a place of tense, carefully worded diplomacy. But today, the diplomacy is shattered. The U.S. ambassador, Jeane Kirkpatrick, stands before the world's representatives. A television monitor is rolled into the chamber. A reel-to-reel tape recorder begins to play. And then, the world hears it. The calm, detached voice of Major Gennady Osipovich, translated for all to hear. I am closing on the target. The target's lights are blinking. I have fired the missile. And then, the final, horrifying confirmation. The target is destroyed. The audio plays out to a stunned, silent chamber. The lie is exposed. The Soviet denial is annihilated in an instant. The evidence is absolute, damning, and incontrovertible. The entire world now knows that the Soviet Union shot down a civilian airliner in cold blood and then lied about it for days. Caught in a blatant, undeniable lie, the Kremlin has no choice but to change its story. The wall of denial crumbles, but in its place they erect a new fortress, this one built not of lies but of justification. The narrative shifts overnight. Yes, we did it. But we were right to do it. You find yourself at a globally televised press conference in Moscow. It is a spectacle of military power and defiance. At the podium is Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, the chief of the Soviet General Staff, a towering, imposing figure in a uniform adorned with medals. He is not there to apologize. He is there to accuse. With maps and charts and pointer in hand, he lays out the new Soviet truth. This, he declares, was no accident. This was a deliberately, carefully planned intelligence operation by the United States. He shows a map depicting the flight path of the American RC-135 spy plane and the path of Cal-07, presenting them as a coordinated, two-pronged attack. He insists the 747 was flying like a military aircraft, changing course and altitude, flying without navigation lights, refusing all attempts at communication. Every claim is a direct contradiction of the known facts, but it is presented with the unshakable authority of the Soviet state. He paints a picture of a nation under siege, bravely defending its sacred borders from a cynical and provocative American plot that used a civilian airliner as a human shield. The message is clear. The blood of the 269 victims is not on Soviet hands, but on the hands of the Pentagon and the CIA. This brings us to our established fact. After initially denying any involvement, the Soviet Union admitted to shooting down Cal-007 only after being confronted with irrefutable audio evidence. They then aggressively defended their actions, claiming the airliner was part of a sophisticated U.S. intelligence operation. This frantic and clumsy shift from denial to justification hints at a deeper, lesser-known reality: the internal chaos within the Soviet power structure. The initial blanket denial was likely not a sophisticated, coordinated lie from the very top, but a symptom of a dysfunctional and compartmentalized system. It's plausible that the military commanders in the Far East, having just shot down what they quickly realized was a civilian airliner, did not immediately forward the full, unvarnished truth to the political leadership in Moscow. The KGB, the military, and the aging General Secretary Yuri Andropov were likely scrambling for information, possibly receiving conflicting reports. This fringe theory suggests a power struggle, with the hardline military trying to control the narrative to prevent the politicians from issuing an apology or admitting a mistake. The contradictory statements weren't just propaganda for the outside world. They were the external signs of a paranoid, broken system arguing with itself. The Soviet press conference ends not with regret, but with a chilling promise. When asked if they would do it again under similar circumstances, the answer is an unapologetic yes. They are not the perpetrators, they are the victims. They are the defenders of the motherland. They have taken the indefensible act of shooting down a passenger plane and transformed it into an act of patriotic duty. This leaves us with a fundamental question that exposes the core weakness of the Soviet position. If shooting down the aircraft was, as they claimed, a legitimate and justifiable act of national defense against a hostile military intruder, why was their first reflexive instinct to lie about it to the entire world for 2 days? Why the desperate cover-up if their actions were, in their own minds, entirely righteous? As the defiant words of the Soviet marshal fade from the world's television screens, a very different response is being crafted in the seat of American power. You are now inside the White House in the first week of September 1983. The atmosphere is not one of confusion, but of focused, strategic anger. The Soviet Union, through its actions and its subsequent clumsy web of lies, has just handed President Ronald Reagan the single greatest propaganda victory of his presidency. For an administration that had already defined the Cold War in starkly moral terms, this was the ultimate real-world example to prove their point. Just months earlier, in March of that same year, Reagan had delivered his famous Evil Empire speech, condemning the Soviet Union as the focus of evil in the modern world. To his critics, it was dangerous, simplistic rhetoric. But now, in the wake of the Cal 007 shootdown, his words suddenly seemed prophetic. The Soviets had provided the horrifying illustration for his thesis. The tragedy did not occur in a political vacuum. It fell like a lit match into a room filled with the explosive fumes of Cold War tension. At the center of the American response is the president himself, Ronald Reagan, the great communicator. He understood the power of television and the power of a simple, compelling narrative better than any politician of his era. The complex, murky details of flight paths and navigational errors were secondary. He saw the core of the story, the element that would resonate with millions of people. A story of good versus evil, of a brutal, godless regime snuffing out the lives of innocent men, women, and children. On September 5th, you join the millions of Americans tuning in as the president addresses the nation from the Oval Office. The speech he delivers is a masterclass in political communication. He doesn't just condemn the action, he condemns the system that produced it. You hear him, his voice filled with a carefully modulated blend of sorrow and steel. He calls the shootdown a massacre, an act of barbarism, and a crime against humanity. He paints a vivid picture for the American people. They were shot down by a Soviet fighter plane. This was the reality of a regime that shoots down an unarmed civilian plane without a word of warning. He seizes on the presence of the American passengers, especially Congressman Larry McDonald, to make the tragedy personal for his audience. He lists the number of victims from other nations, framing the United States not just as a victim, but as the leader of a civilized world outraged by the actions of a rogue state. This is not a political issue, he declares. It is a question of human decency. The most powerful part of his address is when he draws a direct line between the atrocity and the fundamental nature of the Soviet government. He argues that this was not the act of a rogue pilot, but the inevitable product of a society which measures human life in terms of its value to the state. He holds up the tragedy as proof that his evil empire rhetoric was not hyperbole, but a simple statement of fact. This is our established fact. The Reagan administration, led by the president himself, publicly and powerfully condemned the Soviet Union for the attack. They used terms like massacre and crime against humanity to frame the event not as an accident, but as a morally depraved act, leveraging it to galvanize international opinion against the USSR. The American response went far beyond words. Reagan used the immense political capital the incident generated to push his own agenda. He secured funding for his controversial MX missile program. He used the Soviet threat, now made terrifyingly real, to build support for his strategic defense initiative, the Star Wars missile defense system. In coordination with other nations, the U.S. imposed sanctions, including a temporary ban on the Soviet airline, Aeroflot, from landing at American airports. The tragedy of Cal 007 became the fuel for a new, more aggressive phase of the Cold War. But here you must consider a darker, more cynical and lesser-known interpretation of the American reaction. Some researchers and writers have put forth a disturbing theory that elements within the U.S. intelligence community knew the airliner was off course and heading for danger, and they did nothing to stop it. This theory suggests that the potential gains, both in terms of the electronic intelligence gathered by forcing the Soviets to activate their entire air defense network and the incalculable propaganda value of a Soviet atrocity, were deemed to outweigh the lives of the 269 people on board. In this version of events, the United States was not just a horrified observer. It was a cold, calculating participant that allowed the sacrifice to happen. Reagan's powerful, righteous anger is recast as a brilliant, if monstrously cynical performance. The victims of Cal 007 were not just casualties of Soviet aggression, but pawns sacrificed by both sides in a deadly geopolitical chess match. This is, of course, a fringe theory, but it forces us to re-examine the American response. It was almost too perfect, too effective. The Soviets played their role as the clumsy, brutal villain so perfectly that it almost feels scripted. The US masterfully played the role of the avenging hero, the leader of the free world. This leads us to a challenging and deeply uncomfortable question. Was the Reagan administration's powerful and morally righteous condemnation of the Soviet Union a genuine, spontaneous expression of horror at an unforgivable atrocity? Or was it a brilliantly executed, pre-calculated political strategy to exploit a tragedy they may have had more knowledge of than they ever admitted, to achieve their own long-term Cold War objectives? After the storm of accusations and counter-accusations between the superpowers, the world was left with two irreconcilable narratives: a cynical American spy plot or a brutal Soviet massacre. But in the world of aviation, there is a third, far more mundane and methodical path to the truth: the technical investigation. The responsibility for this fell to the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, a specialized agency of the United Nations. Their job is not to assign blame or to score political points. Their job is to find out what went wrong, to understand the chain of technical and human failures, so that it can be prevented from ever happening again. The ICAO investigators faced a monumental task. They had no wreckage, they had no bodies, and most importantly, they had no black boxes: the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder, which held the final crucial moments of the flight. These were lying at the bottom of the sea in a debris field that was being exclusively and secretly salvaged by the Soviet Navy. The investigation, therefore, was a work of reverse engineering, based on fragmented radar data from Japan and the US, the transcripts of the Soviet intercept, and extensive flight simulations. Out of this meticulous, if incomplete work, a consensus began to form around a single central idea. This entire catastrophe, which brought the world to the brink of conflict, was not born from malice but from a simple catastrophic mistake. This is the navigational error theory, the official explanation for the tragedy of Cal 007. To understand it, you have to go back to the cockpit on the tarmac in Anchorage. The Boeing 747's inertial navigation system, the INS, was a technological marvel for its time, but it had a critical requirement. It's a dead reckoning system. This means you must tell it its exact starting position, its latitude and longitude, before you begin the journey. Once it knows where it is, its internal gyroscopes and accelerometers can flawlessly track every tiny movement the plane makes, calculating its new position second by second. But if you give it the wrong starting point, it will perform all its calculations with perfect precision from a perfectly wrong place. The ICAO's primary hypothesis focuses on this single, critical moment of data entry. The longitude of the departure gate at Anchorage was 149 degrees 46 minutes west. The theory posits that the crew, through a simple typo or a moment of inattention, entered the wrong longitude. Perhaps they punched in 139 degrees instead of 149. A single keystroke, a 10-degree error. Or perhaps even more simply, the autopilot was never switched from heading mode to INS mode after takeoff. The pilot might have set the autopilot to follow the runway's magnetic heading, and then, distracted by other duties, simply forgot to engage the sophisticated navigation system. The plane would have then flown a perfectly straight line on that magnetic heading, a path that almost exactly matches the one Cal 007 took into Soviet airspace. The official report paints a picture of a degree of lack of alertness and attentiveness on the part of the entire flight crew. They made the initial error, and then for 5.5 hours, they failed to catch it. Why? Because over the dark, featureless Pacific Ocean at night, there are no landmarks. Their instruments, fed by the faulty data, would have told them they were perfectly on course. Their map displays would have shown their little aircraft icon tracking flawlessly along the Romeo 20 airway. They reported passing their waypoints because their computers told them they had. They were, in essence, flying in a perfectly rendered, but completely false, virtual reality. This is our established fact. The final official ICAO report, published in 1993 after Russia finally handed over the black boxes, concluded that the flight crew of CAL 007 was responsible for the navigational deviation. The report states the probable cause was the crew's failure to select the INS mode on the autopilot, and then their subsequent failure to notice the error through proper cross-checking procedures for the entire duration of the flight. But this neat conclusion, blaming a tired and complacent crew, glosses over a deeply problematic and lesser-known detail: the triple redundancy of the system. There were not one, but 3 independent INS units in that cockpit. For the wrong starting point theory to be true, the crew would have had to make the exact same 10-degree longitude error 3 separate times on 3 separate keypads. The odds of this are astronomically small. Alternatively, if they made an error on only one unit, the other 2 would have flagged a massive discrepancy, something a crew is trained to immediately investigate. For the forgotten switch theory to hold, all 3 crew members, the captain, the co-pilot, and the flight engineer, would have had to collectively ignore one of the most fundamental post-takeoff checklist items for over 5 hours. Many veteran 747 pilots find this level of collective negligence from a senior crew to be almost unbelievable. It's not just an error, it's a complete sustained breakdown of basic airmanship. The official explanation asks us to accept a near impossible level of incompetence. It was an explanation that was, however, politically convenient for everyone. It allowed the aviation world to chalk the incident up to human error, a known and manageable risk. It allowed the Soviets to maintain that the plane was acting abnormally. It allowed the Americans to close the book on the incident without revealing the full scope of their intelligence capabilities in the region. Pilot error was the simplest, cleanest, and least troublesome explanation. This brings us to our challenging question for this section. Can we in good faith accept an official explanation that hinges on a senior, 3-person flight crew committing a series of basic, redundant, and easily detectable errors, and then remaining completely oblivious to a mistake of ever-increasing magnitude for more than 5 consecutive hours? Or is this explanation simply a convenient fiction, designed to mask a much more complex and disturbing truth? The official story is tidy. It's a story of human error, of a tired crew and an over-reliance on automation, resulting in a tragic but ultimately understandable accident. It's a story that allows everyone to close the book and move on. But for many, especially for pilots, air traffic controllers, and navigation experts, this story doesn't just feel incomplete, it feels wrong. When you look past the simple headline of pilot error and examine the actual flight path of CAL 007, the official explanation begins to unravel. The problem isn't the deviation itself, but its character. It was, for lack of a better word, too perfect. Let's begin with the sheer scale of the error. This wasn't a minor drift. Over the course of 5.5 hours, the aircraft strayed more than 360 miles from its intended route. Imagine driving from New York City with the goal of reaching Washington, D.C. Now imagine you somehow end up in Cleveland, Ohio, all while believing you're on the correct highway and seeing the correct road signs. That is the level of navigational failure we are being asked to accept. It is a blunder of monumental proportions. Yet paradoxically, this monumental blunder was executed with breathtaking precision. The track of CAL 007 across the North Pacific was not a sloppy, wandering line as you might expect from a lost or confused pilot. It was a near-perfect rhumb line, a course of constant bearing. For 5.5 hours, the aircraft flew an almost unwavering magnetic heading of 246 degrees. To maintain such a precise track over that distance, through changing wind conditions, is not a sign of sloppiness. It's a sign that the autopilot was engaged and functioning flawlessly, meticulously guiding the aircraft along its designated path. The problem is that it was the wrong path. A simple mistake, like a forgotten switch, seems like a poor explanation for such a determined and precise deviation. A sloppy input should result in a sloppy output. This was a precise output. This is our established fact. The deviation of CAL 007 was not erratic. The aircraft maintained a near-constant magnetic heading for over 5 hours, resulting in a precise, predictable, and ever-widening divergence from its planned route. This precision is what makes so many veteran pilots skeptical of the official story. A flight crew has numerous ways to cross-check their position. In the early part of the flight, They were still in range of ground-based navigational aids (VOR) stations in Alaska. A simple flick of a switch would have shown them on their instruments that their actual position was radically different from what the INS was telling them. Later in the flight, even their weather radar could have been used to paint the coastline of the Kamchatka Peninsula, a coastline that should not have been there. The official story requires you to believe that a crew of 3 professionals not only made a critical error at the outset, but then collectively abandoned the fundamental principles of airmanship and failed to perform a single meaningful cross-check for the entire duration of the flight. But the flight path holds an even more damning secret, a lesser-known detail that directly contradicts the theory of a single, simple mistake at takeoff. After Cal 007 survived the first failed intercept attempt over Kamchatka and flew out over the Sea of Okhotsk, it did something that a plane flying on a simple, constant heading should not do. It made a turn. Radar data shows a distinct, albeit slight, course correction to the right. This turn is critical. It realigned the aircraft's trajectory away from the open ocean and set it on a perfect intercept course with the southern part of Sakhalin Island, home to another major concentration of Soviet military bases. Why is this turn so significant? Because it suggests active, intelligent navigation. It implies that the aircraft was not just blindly flying into the void as a result of an initial error. It suggests the flight path was a series of pre-planned legs. The first leg took it over Kamchatka. The second leg, after the turn, took it over Sakhalin. This is not the signature of an accident. It is the signature of a mission profile. This single, subtle turn in the middle of the flight is an anomaly that the ICAO's forgotten switch theory simply cannot account for. Now the flight path starts to look less like a blunder and more like a carefully drawn line on a map, a line designed to connect the dots between the Soviet Union's most sensitive military installations in the Far East. The deviation is no longer improbable because of the crew's incompetence, but because of its competence. It was too straight, too precise, too perfectly aimed to be a simple mistake. This forces us to ask a difficult question that challenges the very foundation of the official report. If the fatal deviation of Cal 007 was the result of a single simple error made before the flight even began, how can we explain the unwavering precision of the incorrect flight path and, more importantly, the deliberate-looking course correction made hours later that guided the plane from one highly sensitive military region directly to another? If the deviation of Korean Airlines Flight 007 was not a mistake, then you are forced to confront the only other logical possibility. It was intentional. The moment you accept that premise, the entire story transforms. The flight is no longer a tragedy of errors. It becomes an act of war, a covert operation executed on a chillingly grand scale. The 747 is no longer a lost airliner. It is a weapon. This is the heart of the spy plane theory, an explanation so dark and cynical that many refuse to consider it, yet one that resolves the baffling inconsistencies of the official story with a terrifying logic. Welcome to the electronic battlefield. In the Cold War, the most important conflicts were not always fought with bullets and bombs. They were fought with radio waves and radar pulses, in a silent, invisible struggle for information. The most prized intelligence a nation could possess was a detailed understanding of its enemy's air defense network. The location of their radar sites, the frequencies they use, their operational range, their response times, and the communication links between their fighters and ground control. This electronic order of battle is the key to air supremacy in any modern war. But there's a problem. The most advanced and capable parts of this network are kept switched off during peacetime, hidden away to be used only in a real conflict. To see them, you have to make the enemy think a real conflict is happening. You have to force them to light up. This is the central thesis of the spy mission theory. Cal 007 was the lure, the sacrificial goat sent into the most sensitive part of the Soviet Far East for one purpose: to make the Soviets panic. Its predictable, unwavering flight path was not a mistake, but a deliberately provocative route designed to fly over a checklist of high-value military targets. As the 747, a huge radar target, intruded into their airspace, the Soviets would be forced to activate their entire defense apparatus. Early warning radars would switch to their highest power settings. fighter jets would scramble, their onboard fire control radars locking onto the target. Ground controllers would issue frantic commands over encrypted radio channels, and every single electronic pulse, every radio squawk, every change in frequency would be a priceless gem of intelligence. But who would be there to collect these gems? Remember the shadow in the sky we discussed earlier? The RC-135 reconnaissance plane. In this theory, its presence was no coincidence. It was the designated listener. Flying a safe racetrack pattern in international airspace, its sophisticated antennas and sensors would have been perfectly positioned to intercept this sudden flood of electronic data. The RC-135 was the vacuum cleaner, and CAL-07 was the tool used to shake the dust out of the rug. It wasn't just the RC-135 either. The operation would have been a coordinated effort. U.S. intelligence satellites would have been maneuvered overhead. Listening posts in Japan and the Aleutian Islands would have been on high alert. U.S. Navy vessels, and perhaps even submarines in the Sea of Japan, would have their antennas pointed at the sky. It was a full-scale, multi-platform intelligence harvest. This brings us to our established fact for this section. The United States military regularly used platforms like the RC-135 to conduct signals intelligence (SIGINT) missions on the periphery of the Soviet Union. The primary purpose of these missions was to collect data on Soviet air defense systems. The very activity at the heart of this theory was a routine, if dangerous, part of Cold War espionage. But the theory goes deeper, incorporating a lesser-known, more speculative detail: the idea of a mission package. This suggests that CAL-007 and the RC-135 were not the only players. Proponents of this theory argue that other, smaller, and possibly stealthier American aircraft may have been in the area, flying dark without transponders. Their role would have been to provide electronic countermeasures, ECM, to actively jam or confuse Soviet radar. This could explain the almost comical incompetence of the first Soviet intercept attempt over Kamchatka. The Soviet pilots weren't just unlucky, their systems were being actively interfered with by unseen electronic ghosts, all while the RC-135 recorded their flustered, confused response. From a purely military strategic perspective, the plan is both brilliant and diabolical. The use of a civilian airliner is the key. A military bomber, like a B-52, would have been identified and shot down long before it reached sensitive territory. But a civilian 747? It's a soft target that creates confusion and hesitation, allowing it to penetrate deeper and trigger a more comprehensive response. And the plan had a built-in fail-safe. If the mission succeeded and the plane returned to Seoul, perhaps after being forced to land and then released, the US would have its data. If the mission failed and the Soviets shot the plane down, the US would have an unparalleled propaganda victory. The downing of a civilian airliner would prove Reagan's evil empire rhetoric to the world, justifying a massive military buildup. For the cold-blooded strategists who might have planned such an operation, it was a win-win. But for this to be true, you must accept a monstrous moral calculation. You must believe that officials in the United States government knowingly and deliberately sacrificed 269 human beings, including 62 Americans and a US congressman, for a strategic advantage. This is the enormous, horrifying barrier at the heart of this conspiracy theory. It forces you to ask a question that goes to the very core of what governments are capable of. In the high-stakes, paranoid environment of the Cold War, was there a line that intelligence agencies would not cross? Or is it plausible that they would make the ultimate cold-blooded calculation, that the sacrifice of 269 innocent lives was a justifiable price to pay for intelligence that could potentially save hundreds of thousands of lives in a future global conflict? The theory of a deliberate sacrifice is a monstrous one to contemplate. It requires you to believe that military planners and intelligence officials in Washington, D.C. viewed the 269 passengers and crew of CAL-007 not as human beings, but as an acceptable loss, a statistical cost for a greater strategic gain. It is a deeply unsettling idea. But what if one of those passengers wasn't just a random civilian? What if his presence on that specific flight was a crucial part of the cold, hard calculus of the mission? What if he wasn't just a casualty, but a catalyst? We need to talk about the congressman. His name was Lawrence Patton McDonald, a Democratic congressman from Georgia. But that simple title doesn't begin to capture who he was. Larry McDonald was no ordinary politician. He was a doctor by trade, but an ideologue by conviction. He was arguably the most rigidly conservative, staunchly anti-communist member of the entire United States Congress. He was a man who saw the world in black and white, as a relentless struggle between freedom and a global, monolithic communist conspiracy. His defining political identity was his leadership of the John Birch Society, a controversial, far-right organization that believed communist sympathizers had infiltrated the highest levels of the U.S. government, media, and academia. To his supporters, he was a courageous truth-teller. To his detractors, he was a paranoid extremist. But to everyone, he was a powerful and utterly uncompromising enemy of the Soviet Union. He was on his way to Seoul, along with several other members of Congress who had chosen a different flight to attend a celebration of the 30th anniversary of the U.S.-South Korea Mutual Defense Treaty. For McDonald, this was not just a diplomatic courtesy call. It was a trip to the front lines of the Cold War, an opportunity to stand with an ally against the communist threat. And this brings us to the significance of his presence on that doomed flight. A significance that splits the conspiracy narrative into two distinct and equally chilling paths. The first theory incorporates him into the American-led spy mission. In this scenario, McDonald is an unwitting pawn, but a highly valuable one. The planners of the intelligence operation would have known he was on the flight. His presence was a bonus, an accelerant. They knew that if the plane was attacked, the death of a sitting U.S. congressman would ignite a political firestorm in America, that the death of 268 other people, sadly, might not. It would guarantee wall-to-wall media coverage. It would ensure absolute public outrage. It would give President Reagan the perfect justification for the massive anti-Soviet response he was looking for. McDonald's presence in this cynical view was the emotional and political linchpin of the operation's propaganda objective. This is our established fact. Congressman Larry McDonald, a prominent anti-communist and the chairman of the John Birch Society, was a passenger on Cal 07 and was killed when the plane was shot down. But there is a second competing theory, one that flips the script entirely. What if the Soviets were the ones who knew McDonald was on that flight? What if he wasn't the pawn? What if he was the target? This theory posits that the downing of Cal 07 was not an accident, nor was it a response to an American intelligence probe. It was a targeted assassination, a deliberate act by the KGB to eliminate a dangerous and effective political enemy. The Soviets, in this version, were not the dupes. They were the puppet masters. This leads to a fascinating and deeply conspiratorial lesser-known theory about how they could have pulled it off. The idea of navigational spoofing. This theory suggests that the Soviets didn't just passively track the plane as it went off course. They pulled it off course. Using powerful ground-based radio transmitters in Kamchatka, they could have broadcast false navigational signals, tricking the plane's automated systems into thinking it was on the right path when it was actually being electronically hijacked and lured into Soviet airspace. The perfect, precise deviation of the flight path wasn't the result of a pilot error or a secret American flight plan. It was the work of Soviet electronic warfare, creating the perfect pretext to shoot the plane down and kill the man they wanted dead. Suddenly, the Soviets' actions make a different kind of sense. Their seemingly incompetent first intercept attempt could have been deliberate, allowing the plane to continue to the second trap over Sakhalin, further justifying the shootdown. Their immediate lies were not a sign of panic, but a pre-planned part of the cover story. The target was Larry McDonald, and the other 268 people on board were simply collateral damage in a KGB hit. Whether he was a pawn, a target, or simply the most famous victim of a tragic accident, Congressman McDonald's presence fundamentally altered the landscape of the event. His death galvanized the American conservative movement for years, turning him into a martyr for the anti-communist cause. It gave a human face, an American political face, to the tragedy, making it impossible for the world to look away. This forces us to ask a critical question about causality and coincidence. Does the presence of one politically significant individual on a plane carrying 269 people truly suggest a motive for a conspiracy, whether American or Soviet? Or is it more likely that in a world of global air travel, it was simply a tragic coincidence, a case of the wrong man being on the wrong plane at the exact wrong time? For any air crash investigator, the single most vital pieces of evidence are the flight recorders. You probably know them by their famous, if inaccurate, name, the black boxes. In reality, they are painted bright orange to make them easier to find amidst the wreckage. Inside every large commercial aircraft, there are two. The first is the cockpit voice recorder, the CVR, which captures the last 30 minutes of all sound in the cockpit. The pilots' voices, their conversations with air traffic control, the audible alarms of the aircraft, and any other ambient sound like the chilling noise of an explosion or the straining of a metal airframe. The second is the flight data recorder, the FDR, which records hundreds of different parameters, a constant stream of data about the plane's altitude, airspeed, heading, engine performance, and the pilot's control inputs. Together, they are the ghost of the machine, a final objective testament to what happened in the moments between routine flight and catastrophe. Finding them was the only way to truly know what happened inside Cal 07. And so, in the days following the shootdown, a massive and deeply tense search operation began in the Sea of Japan. The United States and Japan sent a fleet of ships to the area, their mission, at least publicly, being to search for survivors and recover the wreckage. But their primary unspoken objective was to find those black boxes. The problem was the location. The debris field lay just west of Sakhalin Island, in waters the Soviet Union claimed as its own. What unfolded was not a cooperative, humanitarian search. It was a Cold War naval standoff. You can picture the scene. American and Japanese search vessels meticulously combing the sea, with Soviet destroyers and cruisers shadowing their every move, sometimes coming dangerously close, engaging in a tense maritime cat-and-mouse game. The Soviets cordoned off the primary crash zone, declaring it off-limits to foreign ships. Their message was clear: you will not search here. The official reason they gave was national security, but the real reason was obvious. They were not trying to find the black boxes with the international community. They were trying to find them first. Days turned into weeks. The Soviets, who knew the exact location of the shootdown and had the best information on winds and currents, maintained their official position. The wreckage and the black boxes were lost, likely buried deep in the silt at the bottom of the sea, impossible to find. For months, and then for years, this remained their story. The black boxes of Cal 07 were gone forever. It was a lie. A calculated, cynical lie that would be maintained for nearly a decade. This is our established fact. For 9 years, from 1983 to 1992, the government of the Soviet Union publicly denied that it had found or possessed the flight recorders from Cal 07, claiming they were unrecoverable. The truth, as we now know, is a far more secretive and telling story. This is the lesser-known detail that exposes the depth of the Soviet deception. While their warships were blocking the international search effort, the Soviets were conducting their own top-secret recovery mission. Within days of the shootdown, their own deep-sea divers were on the seabed. On September 20th, less than 3 weeks after the crash, they found the wreckage. And by the end of October, they had recovered both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. They had them. They took them to Moscow, where a special team from the KGB and the Air Force analyzed their contents in secret. And then, they locked them away and denied their very existence. The lie was absolute, and it begs a profound question. Why? Why go to such extraordinary lengths? Why engage in a tense naval standoff, risk international ridicule, and maintain a blatant lie for 9 years? The simple answer is that the tapes contradicted their public narrative that the plane was a spy craft behaving erratically. But the sheer duration and stubbornness of the lie has led many to a deeper, more conspiratorial conclusion. The tapes must have held a secret so damning, so explosive, that they were willing to do anything to keep it buried. Did the CVR capture the pilots reacting to a Soviet radio hail they later claimed to have sent? Did the FDR show a flight path that was even more precise than previously thought? Or, in the most extreme theory, Did the tapes contain evidence of something else entirely? Proof of the electronic navigational spoofing we discussed earlier, or some other phenomenon that would completely rewrite the history of the Cold War? For 9 years, the world could only speculate. Then, in 1992, the world changed. The Soviet Union was no more. In its place was the new Russian Federation, led by President Boris Yeltsin, a man eager to demonstrate a new era of openness, or glasnost, with the West. In a move of stunning diplomatic theater, during a meeting with American and South Korean officials, Yeltsin made a dramatic admission. "We had the black box," he said, and then, turning to an aide, he gave the order for it to be released. The 9-year lie was over. He presented the recorders as a gesture of goodwill, a final closing of a dark chapter of Soviet history. The mystery of the missing black boxes was solved, but a far more important one had just opened up. After nearly a decade of silence, the voices of the dead were about to speak. The world held its breath, waiting to finally learn the truth. This leaves us with a critical and lingering question from that 9-year period of deception. What could possibly have been recorded on those tapes that was so damaging to the Soviet Union that they chose to perpetuate a globally recognized lie for nearly a decade, a lie that only deepened suspicion and made them look guilty of far more than they were already accused of? After 9 years of lies, stonewalling, and intense speculation, the black boxes of Korean Airlines Flight 007 were finally in the hands of the international community. You can imagine the scene at the ICAO headquarters in Paris. A team of the world's top aviation experts, engineers, and translators gather in a secure laboratory. The orange boxes, slightly corroded from their years at the bottom of the sea, are carefully opened. Inside, the delicate magnetic tapes, the final witnesses to the tragedy, are found to be in remarkably good condition. The entire world is waiting. The families of the victims are desperate for answers. The governments of the world are anxious to see whose version of the truth would be vindicated. Would the tapes prove a cynical American spy plot, a premeditated Soviet assassination, or something else entirely? The flight data recorder was analyzed first. Its data stream, a cold, hard record of the aircraft's every move, was downloaded and decoded. The truth it told was immediate and shocking in its simplicity. From the moment of takeoff, the FDR showed the aircraft was not following its intended programmed INS route. Instead, the data confirmed that the autopilot was engaged in the more basic heading mode, slavishly following a constant magnetic course of 246 degrees. The black box seemed to confirm the ICAO's initial theory completely. There were no evasive maneuvers, no unusual changes in speed or altitude to suggest the pilots were aware of the interceptors. It was a straight, unwavering line, exactly as a simple navigational error would produce. For the spy plane theorists, it was a devastating blow. Then came the cockpit voice recorder. Investigators listened intently to the last 30 minutes of the flight crew's lives. What they heard was not a scene of high tension or covert operations. What they heard was boredom. The pilots were engaged in utterly mundane conversation. They talked about airport procedures. They discussed their schedules. There were long stretches of silence, punctuated by the routine professional radio calls to air traffic control. Right up until the moment you hear the sound of the missile's explosion, there is not a single word of alarm. Not a single indication that they knew they were hundreds of miles off course. No mention of Soviet fighters off their wing. No hint that they heard any warning shots or radio calls. The CVR painted a damning picture of a crew that was, for all intents and purposes, asleep at the wheel. A crew so complacent and disengaged that they flew into the heart of the dragon's lair without ever noticing. The mystery, it seemed, was over. In 1993, the ICAO issued its final report, with the black box data as its unshakable foundation. The conclusion was blunt. The probable cause was a failure of the flight crew to properly navigate their aircraft. It was pilot error. The most mundane explanation had won. After all the lies, all the geopolitical drama, all the conspiracy theories, the answer was just a simple, tragic human mistake. This is our established fact. The official analysis of the CAL 007 black boxes, released in 1993, concluded that the flight data supported the navigational error theory, while the cockpit voice recorder indicated the crew was unaware of their predicament until the moment of the missile strike. But the story of the black boxes did not end there. In fact, for many, this is where the real mystery begins. A number of independent researchers and even the official South Korean investigator began to raise serious questions about the authenticity of the tapes they had been given. This is a crucial, lesser-known detail. The black boxes that were supposed to provide the final answers were themselves deeply suspicious. Critics pointed to evidence of potential tampering. They noted that the tapes were handed over by the Russians without a proper chain of custody, making it impossible to verify they hadn't been altered during their 9 years in a KGB vault. Audio analysts reported strange clicks and hums on the CVR, suggesting possible edits or splicing. But the single most damning piece of evidence against the tape's authenticity is not what's on them, but what is missing. The cockpit voice recorder tape ends just 1 minute and 44 seconds after the missile explosion. But we know, from Soviet and American radar, that the plane continued to fly in a horrifying spiraling descent for up to 12 minutes. Where are the other 10 minutes of tape? 10 minutes of what must have been chaos, terror, and a desperate struggle for control. The official Russian explanation was that the explosion cut the power to the recorder, but the CVR is designed with its own independent power supply to prevent exactly that. The missing 10 minutes are a black hole at the heart of the official story. What was said in that cockpit as the plane fell from the sky? Did the pilots realize what had happened? Did they talk about a water landing? Did they see something else out their windows? Those missing minutes are where the darkest conspiracy theories thrive. This leads us to the most critical question of all regarding the physical evidence. Why would the Soviet Union lie for 9 years about having the black boxes, risking international condemnation, only to hand over tapes that conveniently confirm the simplest pilot error explanation, an explanation that makes the Soviets look marginally better, especially when the tapes themselves are incomplete and show signs that suggest they may have been edited or tampered with? What was on the final 10 minutes of that recording that was so terrifying, so damning that it had to be erased from history? The black boxes, which for 9 years were believed to hold the ultimate truth, ended up posing more questions than they answered. The data they contained seemed to support a simple, mundane explanation, yet the tapes themselves were shrouded in suspicion, with missing minutes that created a vacuum of information. What happened in those final 10 minutes of Cal 007's descent, a period of time that was deliberately, it seems, erased from the official record? For some investigators, the silence on that tape isn't an absence of evidence. It is the evidence itself. It is a curtain drawn to hide the most shocking possibility of all, that the plane did not crash into the sea in a violent, uncontrolled dive. It landed. This is the phantom landing theory, one of the most enduring and controversial aspects of the entire Cal 007 saga. It is a theory born directly from the established facts that the official explanation struggles to account for. First, the 12-minute descent. A plane that was catastrophically destroyed does not spiral gracefully for 12 minutes. This prolonged, relatively stable descent suggests the aircraft, while crippled, was still largely in one piece and possessed some degree of aerodynamic integrity. Second, the missing 10 minutes of the cockpit voice recording. This provides the time frame. What if, in those 10 minutes, the pilots, having dealt with the initial chaos, managed to regain some partial control? What if they were desperately fighting to bring the aircraft to a survivable water landing, a controlled ditching? And third, there is the perplexing lack of evidence at the crash site. In the aftermath of a high-altitude disaster where a plane hits the water at hundreds of miles per hour, you would expect to see a massive field of floating debris, a slick of jet fuel, thousands of floating seat cushions, luggage, and grimly, the remains of the victims. But the international search teams that combed the area found almost nothing. For a flight with 269 people on board, the sea was eerily empty. The official explanation is that the bodies and wreckage sank in the deep water. But to proponents of the ditching theory, the explanation is simpler. There was no massive high-speed impact. The plane came down in one piece. Imagine it. You are in the cockpit. The alarms are still screaming. The plane is barely controllable. But through incredible airmanship, Captain Chun and his crew manage to level the wings as they approach the water. They execute a controlled ditching in the shallow seas just off the coast of Sakhalin. or the even smaller and more secretive Moneron Island nearby. The impact is violent, but survivable. The fuselage breaks apart but remains largely intact. The passengers, trained by the emergency briefing, deploy the life rafts and evacuate into the freezing dark water. They are alive. They are survivors, waiting for rescue. This brings us to our established fact. The official search and recovery operations found very little floating wreckage and recovered only a handful of human remains from the 269 victims. The vast majority of the passengers and their belongings were never found on the surface of the sea. This is where the theory takes an even darker turn. The rescue party that arrived was not an international one. It was the Soviet military. KGB patrol boats and Spetsnaz special forces who had been tracking the plane's descent were waiting. They were not there to offer blankets and warm drinks. They were there to capture prisoners. The survivors, including Congressman Larry McDonald, were pulled from their life rafts, their existence immediately classified as a state secret. The Soviets then, according to this theory, undertook a massive cover-up. They used explosives to destroy the ditched fuselage on the seabed, creating a scattered fake debris field. They then cordoned off the area to prevent international search teams from discovering the truth, that the crash was survivable. Why would they do this? Because the existence of survivors was the one thing that could utterly destroy their narrative. If they rescued the passengers, they would have to admit they shot down an unarmed airliner filled with civilians, making their spy plane claims look absurd and monstrous. But by capturing them, they could silence the witnesses forever and interrogate the high-value targets like the congressman for any intelligence they might possess. This fringe theory is supported by a few tantalizing, if unverified, pieces of anecdotal evidence. There are reports from Japanese fishermen in the area who claimed they saw the plane's lights descending and then saw a flash on or near the water, not high in the air. We also have that bizarre early report from Korean Airlines telling families the plane had landed safely on Sakhalin. Was that just a cruel mistake, or an initial leak of the truth before the official story was cemented? This leads us to a challenging and deeply disturbing question. Given the Soviet Union's proven willingness to lie for 9 years about the black boxes and their deliberate obstruction of the search area, is it truly beyond the realm of possibility that they would also lie about finding survivors? Or is the idea of a controlled 747 ditching in the dark and a subsequent mass abduction by the KGB simply too fantastic to believe? Even if you find the theory of a phantom landing and a mass abduction too extreme to believe, the events that transpired in the waters off Sakhalin Island in the autumn of 1983 are in themselves a case study in Cold War paranoia and deception. What was officially billed as a humanitarian search and rescue mission quickly devolved into a tense naval confrontation, a high-stakes game of cat and mouse played out above the watery graves of 269 people. The search for Cal 007 was not a mission of discovery. It was a mission of concealment. In the immediate aftermath, a massive international fleet converged on the Sea of Japan. You see ships from the US Navy and Coast Guard, vessels from the Japanese Maritime Safety Agency, and ships from South Korea. It is one of the largest and most expensive air-sea search operations ever mounted. For the first few days, the official objective is to find survivors. Hope is a powerful force, and despite the grim reality of a high-altitude disaster, the world watches and waits for a miracle. The Soviet Union publicly offers its assistance, but its actions tell a very different story. You are on the bridge of a US Navy destroyer, the USS Badger. You are methodically sweeping a designated search grid. Suddenly, a Soviet Kara-class cruiser appears, sailing at high speed directly through your formation, forcing your ships to break course to avoid a collision. Later, as you try to deploy sensitive sonar equipment, a Soviet freighter inexplicably anchors itself directly in your path. Communications are jammed. Soviet fighter jets buzz your ships at low altitude in acts of deliberate intimidation. It quickly becomes clear this is not cooperation. This is obstruction. The Soviets are not helping the search. They are actively sabotaging it. After about a week, the mission's designation changes from search and rescue to search and recovery. The faint hope for survivors is extinguished. The new prize is the wreckage, and specifically, the 2 black boxes resting somewhere on the seabed. The search now transforms from a humanitarian effort into a raw intelligence battle. The Americans want the boxes to learn the truth. The Soviets want the boxes to bury the truth. And this is where the deception becomes truly audacious. The primary tool for locating a submerged black box is its pinger, an underwater locator beacon that emits a distinct acoustic pulse for at least 30 days. The U.S. Navy deployed specialized salvage ships equipped with highly sensitive towed sonar arrays, designed to listen for that specific ping. And soon they found one. A clear, steady ping emanating from the depths. The entire U.S. search fleet converged on the location, believing they had found the crash site. They spent weeks meticulously searching that specific area. This is our established fact. The U.S.-led international search for Cal 007 was one of the largest in history, costing tens of millions of dollars. The entire operation was marked by severe tension with the Soviet Navy, which actively interfered with and obstructed the search efforts. But here is where a stunning, lesser-known theory emerges, one that turns Soviet obstruction into a brilliant act of counterintelligence, the theory of the decoy pingers. Proponents of this theory are convinced that the pings the U.S. Navy was chasing were not coming from the black boxes of Cal 007. They were coming from decoy beacons, deliberately planted on the seafloor by the Soviet Navy to lead the Americans astray. While the massive technologically advanced U.S. fleet was engaged in a multi-million-dollar wild goose chase, spending weeks searching a barren patch of ocean miles away, Soviet divers and miniature submarines were working undisturbed at the real crash site, recovering the wreckage, the bodies, and the all-important black boxes. If true, it is one of the most successful and cynical deception operations of the entire Cold War. The Soviets didn't just hide the evidence. They used the Americans' own technology against them, making them waste their time and resources looking for a ghost. The search for the Americans was a spectacular and public failure. After 2 months of effort, all they had to show for it were a few small pieces of cabin wreckage, some personal items, and a handful of unidentified human remains. They never found the main fuselage. They never found the engines. They never found the black boxes. The Soviets, meanwhile, would occasionally present their own carefully curated pieces of wreckage to the international media. Items they claimed to have found, items that conveniently supported their narrative. The entire operation was a masterfully managed piece of theater, controlled entirely by them. In early November, the international search was officially called off. The weather was worsening. The pinger batteries would have long since died, and there was nothing left to find. The Soviets had won. They controlled the physical evidence, and by extension, they controlled the official truth for the next 9 years. This leaves us with a stark and unavoidable question about the entire operation. Why would the Soviet Union mount such an aggressive, systematic, and expensive campaign to obstruct what was, on the face of it, a humanitarian search? What were they so desperate to hide at the bottom of the Sea of Japan that they were willing to risk a direct military confrontation with the United States to keep it secret? The successful Soviet deception in the waters off Sakhalin Island accomplished its primary goal. It created a black hole, an absolute void of verifiable physical evidence. For 9 years, the world could not know what truly rested at the bottom of the sea. And into this dark void, whispers began to echo. These whispers grew into persistent rumors, fragments of intelligence, and desperate reports that suggested a truth far more horrifying than a simple, tragic crash. These were the voices from the Gulag. The theory that survivors of Cal 07 were captured and imprisoned is born from the deep well of Soviet deceit. If they would lie about the shootdown, lie about the black boxes, and lie about the search, is it so hard to believe they would lie about finding survivors? The foundation of the theory rests on the anomalies we've already discussed. The long 12-minute descent indicating a largely intact airframe, the missing 10 minutes from the cockpit voice recorder, and the conspicuous lack of bodies and floating debris. For proponents of the survivor theory, these aren't just inconsistencies. They are clues that point to a controlled ditching and a secret, horrifying aftermath. If there were survivors, they would have vanished from the face of the earth. Declared dead by the world, they would have become ghosts, swallowed alive by the vast and brutal Soviet prison system. They would have no names, only numbers. Their existence would be a state secret of the highest order. But secrets, even in a totalitarian state, have a way of leaking out. In the years following the disaster, a number of Soviet dissidents and former political prisoners began to report hearing stories inside the camps. The most prominent of these voices was Avraham Shifrin, a former Soviet major who had spent a decade in the Gulag before emigrating to Israel. Through a network of contacts he maintained within the prison system, Shifrin claimed to have received chilling reports. He alleged that the survivors were taken from the water, interrogated on Sakhalin Island, and then secretly transported to the mainland. He claimed they were separated, men from women, healthy from injured, and dispersed into a series of secret camps and psychiatric prisons reserved for high-value foreign prisoners. Most explosively, Shifrin claimed his sources confirmed that Congressman Larry McDonald had survived and was taken to the infamous Lubyanka prison in Moscow, the headquarters of the KGB, for special interrogation. These are, of course, the unverified claims of a dissident, easy to dismiss. But other, more official whispers began to surface. In the early 1990s, after the fall of the USSR, a committee in the U.S. Senate, led by Jesse Helms, was investigating the fate of American POWs who were believed to have been taken to the Soviet Union. Their investigation expanded to include the victims of Cal 007. They wrote to Russian President Boris Yeltsin, demanding answers. A now famous letter, allegedly from the Yeltsin government, came back with a carefully worded statement that many see as a veiled admission. The letter stated that their investigation had concluded no survivors were taken to Soviet camps, but then added a crucial qualifier. This conclusion did not extend to those who might have been held in facilities run by the KGB's counterintelligence departments. It was a bureaucratic, non-denial denial that seemed to leave the door wide open for the possibility of secret prisoners. This is our established fact. Despite numerous unofficial reports and requests from family members and government officials, no government, including the United States and Russia, has ever officially acknowledged that any passenger or crew member from Cal 007 survived the event. The official death toll remains 269, but the most haunting reports are the most personal ones. This is the lesser-known fringe element of the story that keeps the hope and the horror alive. There is the story, circulated in intelligence circles, of an intercepted phone call. In the mid-1980s, Japanese intelligence reportedly picked up a brief, desperate call from a remote Siberian location. On the line was a woman speaking Japanese with a distinct American accent. She claimed to be a survivor from the Korean airliner. She pleaded for help before the line was abruptly cut. Was it a cruel hoax, or a genuine voice from the abyss? We will likely never know. Family members of the victims have also reported receiving cryptic anonymous phone calls over the years. Calls with no one speaking on the other end. Just the sound of breathing calls that they believe were desperate failed attempts by their loved ones to reach out. This forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question about what our own governments might know. Why have these persistent and sometimes detailed reports about survivors been so consistently and officially ignored by the United States government for decades? Is it simply because there is no smoking gun, no piece of verifiable evidence? Or is it because acknowledging the possibility of living American prisoners in Russia would open a Pandora's box of diplomatic and political horrors, revealing a level of Cold War atrocity, and perhaps even American complicity in the initial incident, that is simply too explosive to ever admit? While the fate of the passengers and crew of Cal 007 remains lost in a fog of secrets and sorrow, the story of the man who pulled the trigger is much clearer. For years, he was the faceless villain of the piece, a caricature of the soulless Soviet automaton. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Lieutenant Colonel Gennady Osipovich was finally able to speak for himself, and the story he told did not clarify the mystery. Instead, it added a new, profound layer of contradiction that completely dismantled the official narrative he once served. For a decade, the world knew only the official Soviet version of events, a story that was reflected in Osipovich's own after-action report from 1983. In that report, he was the dutiful soldier, intercepting a mysterious, unidentified aircraft that was behaving like a military spy plane. It was flying without lights, he claimed. He could not identify its type in the dark. He fired warning shots that were ignored. He followed his orders and destroyed a hostile military target. It was a clean, if brutal, narrative of national defense. Then, in a series of interviews in the 1990s, most notably with the New York Times, the real Gennady Osipovich emerged, and he systematically demolished that official story. You are a journalist, sitting across from this retired pilot, a man who has carried the weight of this event for over a decade, and he begins to tell you what he really saw that night, the first bombshell. He knew it wasn't an RC-135. I saw 2 rows of windows, he told the interviewer, and knew that it was a Boeing. I knew this was a civilian plane. This single admission shatters the entire foundation of the Soviet mistaken identity defense. It was never a mistake. He knew what he was looking at. The second bombshell, he recanted his claim that the plane was flying dark. He admitted he could see its lights. I saw a blinking light, he stated plainly, referring to the anti-collision strobe. This directly corroborates the evidence from the CVR that the plane's lights were operational, and it proves that his official report, and the entire Soviet case built upon it, was based on a deliberate falsehood. He still maintained that he believed the civilian plane was on a spy mission. In his mind, its provocative flight path was all the evidence he needed. But the critical distinction is that he was not confused about what he was shooting at. He was making a conscious decision under orders to shoot down an aircraft he knew to be a passenger jet. This brings us to our established fact. Years after the event, Gennady Osipovich, the pilot who shot down Cal-007, publicly stated in interviews that he knew he was firing on a civilian Boeing-type aircraft. He admitted he could see its lights and windows, directly contradicting the official Soviet narrative of mistaken identity that he himself had originally reported. His later testimony also contained another fascinating, if self-serving, detail. A lesser-known claim that adds another strange wrinkle to the story. Osipovich insisted that his intention was not to completely destroy the aircraft. I did not want to shoot it down, he claimed. He said his goal was to damage it enough to force it to land on Soviet territory. He argued that this is why he didn't use his heat-seeking missiles first, which would have surely obliterated an engine and the wing. Instead, he chose his radar-guided missiles and deliberately aimed, he claimed, to strike near the tail, hoping to disable the plane's controls without causing a catastrophic explosion. Now, it is highly debatable whether a pilot can aim an air-to-air missile with that kind of surgical precision. But this claim is extraordinary. The man who shot down the plane says he was trying to force it to land. Does this lend a strange, unexpected credence to the phantom landing theory? If the pilot's intent was to cripple, not annihilate, it makes the idea of a controlled ditching seem slightly less implausible. It suggests that, from the attacker's own perspective, a survivable outcome was, at least in his mind, a possibility. The contradictions between Osipovich's 2 stories, the official 1983 report and the candid 1996 interview, are vast. He never showed any remorse, insisting to his death that he was a soldier who did his duty and would do it again. But his revised testimony leaves us with a critical question about his motives. Why would a decorated military pilot, years after the fact, so thoroughly discredit the official story that had been his and his country's shield for over a decade? Was it the heavy conscience of an old man, finally seeking to tell the truth? Was it professional pride, a desire to be remembered as a competent pilot who correctly identified his target, rather than a clumsy one who couldn't tell a 747 from a spy plane? Or was the truth, like everything else in this story, somewhere in between? To understand how a veteran pilot could knowingly fire a missile at a passenger jet, and how a global superpower could brazenly lie to the world about it, you must pull the camera back from the cockpit and from the command bunkers. You have to look at the world as it was in the year 1983. The tragedy of Cal-07 did not happen in a vacuum. It was a single violent spasm in what was arguably the most dangerous year of the entire Cold War since the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was a time of profound and palpable fear, an era when both sides were convinced that a nuclear first strike was not just possible, but imminent. You have to step into the mindset of the 2 aging, ideologically opposed leaders at the helm of the world's nuclear arsenals. In the White House, you have Ronald Reagan. Just 5 months before the shootdown, he had stood before the world and branded the Soviet Union the evil empire, casting the Cold War as a moral struggle between right and wrong. good and evil. A few weeks later, he announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, a plan for a space-based missile shield. To Americans, it sounded like a purely defensive measure. But to the Soviets, it was a weapon of terrifying aggression. A workable missile shield, in their eyes, would nullify their nuclear deterrent and make a U.S. first strike survivable, and therefore, thinkable. The Reagan administration was also engaged in a series of aggressive psychological operations, or peace PSYOPs. U.S. Navy fleets conducted massive exercises in the Pacific, closer to Soviet shores than ever before. American bombers would fly directly at the Soviet border, peeling off only at the last possible second, testing their reaction times and fraying their nerves. The message from Washington was clear. The era of détente was over. This was a new, more aggressive game. Now you have to cross the globe and enter the paranoid, secretive world of the Kremlin. The man in charge is Yuri Andropov, the former head of the KGB. He is old and failing health and deeply suspicious of the charismatic American president, whom he sees as a reckless cowboy. Andropov and the old guard of the Politburo genuinely believed that Reagan's rhetoric and military buildup were the prelude to a surprise nuclear attack. This fear was so acute that Andropov initiated Operation Ryan, a top-secret worldwide intelligence program. The acronym stood for Raketno Yadernoye Napadenie, nuclear missile attack. KGB agents across the globe were ordered to watch for any sign that the West was preparing for war. Were lights on late at the Pentagon? Was there unusual activity at U.S. military bases? Was there an increase in blood donations? It was a state-sponsored paranoia on a global scale. This is our established fact. The year 1983 was marked by a severe escalation in Cold War tensions. Reagan's aggressive anti-Soviet rhetoric and military policies, combined with a deep-seated paranoia in the Kremlin under Yuri Andropov, created an atmosphere of mutual suspicion where both sides believed a nuclear war was a real possibility. KAL-007 flew directly into this tinderbox. The Soviet air defense forces in the Far East were not on a normal peacetime footing. They were on a hair-trigger alert, their commanders indoctrinated with the belief that any border incursion could be the opening salvo of World War III. When their radar screens showed a large American-made aircraft flying a precise, unwavering line over their most sensitive nuclear submarine and missile bases, they did not see a lost airliner. Through the distorted lens of Operation Ryan, they saw a potential precursor to a decapitation strike. They saw a rehearsal for the end of the world. In this context, the order to destroy the target becomes less an act of inexplicable malice and more a terrifyingly logical, if catastrophically flawed, defensive reflex. This context is deepened by a lesser-known and even more chilling event from that year, a NATO wargame called Able Archer 83. This exercise, which took place just 2 months after the KAL-07 shootdown, was the most realistic nuclear release simulation ever conducted. It involved encrypted communications, heads of state, and simulated troop movements. It was so realistic that the paranoid KGB, primed by months of tension and the recent shootdown, briefly believed it was a cover for a real first strike. Newly declassified documents show that the Soviets went on high alert, likely readying their own nuclear missiles for a retaliatory launch. The world came perilously close to nuclear war in November of 1983, and almost no one knew it at the time. Some theorists now view the KAL-007 incident as an overture to this nuclear drama. Was the American-led spy mission, if it existed, a final desperate attempt to gather intelligence on Soviet command and control capabilities before the West engaged in its most dangerous nuclear exercise? The timing is, at the very least, deeply suspicious. This forces us to re-examine the entire incident through a wider, more terrifying lens. Does placing the shootdown within the intensely paranoid high-stakes context of 1983 make the extreme actions of both superpowers, the Soviets' brutality, the Americans' potential cynicism, seem less like isolated choices and more like the tragic, almost inevitable consequences of a world order teetering on the brink of self-destruction? While the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, occupied the center of the world stage in the aftermath of the shootdown, there was a third nation with a ringside seat to the tragedy. A nation that was closer to the events than any other. A nation whose role was absolutely pivotal and yet is often relegated to a footnote. To truly understand the full picture of that night, you have to examine the Japanese connection. Japan in 1983 was in a unique and precarious position. It was a firm American ally, hosting a massive U.S. military presence. At the same time, it was a geographical neighbor to the Soviet Union. The northernmost tip of its northernmost island, Hokkaido, is a mere 27 miles from the Soviet-controlled Sakhalin Island. This proximity made Japan the single most important listening post for American and Japanese intelligence in the entire Far East. You are now at the Wakkanai Air Station, a bleak and windswept base on the very edge of Japan. This is the nerve center of the Japan Self-Defense Forces Signals Intelligence, or SIGINT, operations. It is a place filled with antennas and analysts whose entire job is to listen to the secret radio traffic of the Soviet military just across the water. On the night of August 31, 1983, this is where the first whispers of the tragedy were heard by the outside world. The Japanese analysts at Wakkanai didn't just stumble upon the events, they were likely monitoring the situation from the very beginning. Their own air defense radars would have painted a clear picture of KAL 07's dramatic deviation from its flight path. They would have watched in real time as the green blip of the 747 flew steadily north, on a collision course with Soviet airspace. They saw it happen, and more importantly, they heard it happen. You are one of those analysts, a headset pressed to your ears, listening to the crackle of Russian voices. You hear the initial, confused reports from the air defense sector in Kamchatka. You hear the angry, frustrated commands as the first intercept attempt fails. Then, as the plane approaches Sakhalin, you hear the chatter intensify. You record the voice of a new pilot, Major Osipovich, as he is scrambled to intercept. You listen minute by minute as he closes on the target, identifies it, and asks for instructions. And you are the one who records his final, chilling transmission. The target is destroyed. The analysts at Wakkanai were the first people in the free world to know with absolute certainty that the Soviets had just shot down an airplane. This is our established fact. The Japan Self-Defense Forces at Wakkanai intercepted and recorded the real-time voice communications between the Soviet pilot and ground control during the attack. This raw intelligence was shared with the United States and became the undeniable smoking gun evidence that proved the Soviet Union's culpability to the world. Japan's role was not just passive. Their air traffic controllers in Tokyo were the last people to have routine communication with the crew of KAL 07. The pilots were on a Japanese frequency, in Japanese-controlled airspace just before they were shot down. This is where the story moves from intelligence gathering to a deeply troubling question of moral and legal responsibility. This is the lesser-known, deeply controversial theory regarding the Japanese connection, that they knew the plane was in mortal danger and did nothing to prevent it. Think about the timeline. Japanese military radar tracked the airliner's deviation for hours. Japanese civil aviation radar also would have shown the plane was not where it was supposed to be. They had the plane on their screens, and they could hear the Soviets preparing to attack it. A single radio call from a Japanese air traffic controller on the international emergency frequency, a simple Korean Air 007, be advised you are severely off course and approaching Soviet airspace, could have alerted the crew and saved 269 lives. That call was never made. Why? The official explanation is a bureaucratic one. The plane was technically just outside the primary radar coverage of civilian air traffic control, and there was no protocol for the military to speak directly to civilian aircraft. But to many critics, this explanation is absurdly weak. In an emergency, you break protocol. The chilling alternative theory is that there was no failure of communication. There was a deliberate decision not to communicate. In this version of events, Japanese intelligence, working in lockstep with their American counterparts, were under strict orders. Their mission was not to save the plane. Their mission was to listen, to silently observe and record the full, unvarnished Soviet response to the intrusion. The 269 people on board were sacrificed for the intelligence their deaths would generate. In this narrative, Japan is no longer just a witness, it is a silent accomplice. This leaves us with a profound and disturbing question that cuts to the heart of national sovereignty and moral responsibility. If Japanese military and civilian authorities were tracking a passenger jet on their radar screens for an extended period, watching it fly directly towards one of the most hostile airspaces on Earth. Why was no warning ever issued? Was this a catastrophic and inexplicable failure of protocol, or was it a deliberate, cynical decision to prioritize the gathering of intelligence over the preservation of 269 human lives? Japan's role as the key listening post in the region highlights a crucial and frustratingly complex element of this mystery: the radar data. In our modern world, you think of radar as an infallible eye in the sky, a source of objective, unimpeachable truth. A radar screen shows you where something is, how fast it's going, and what direction it's heading. In theory, if you could take the radar tapes from the Soviet Union, Japan, and the United States and overlay them, you should get a single, perfect, unified picture of KAL 007's final flight. But that is not what we have. Instead, the radar data is a fractured, contradictory, and incomplete mosaic, with gaps and inconsistencies that seem to deepen the mystery rather than solve it. First, you have the Soviet data. This was military air defense radar, powerful and focused on protecting their sovereign territory. Their tapes tracked the intruder across Kamchatka and Sakhalin. This data was crucial for understanding the intercept itself, but it was also self-serving, presented to the world by the perpetrators to justify their own actions. For example, the Soviets initially claimed their radar showed the plane making evasive maneuvers and changing altitude, classic behavior for a military reconnaissance flight. This was later contradicted by the recovered flight data recorder, which showed a steady, constant cruise. So, was the Soviet radar simply inaccurate? Or was the data deliberately falsified to build their case? Next, you have the Japanese data. This was a combination of civilian air traffic control radar and military radar from the Japan Self-Defense Forces. They had excellent coverage of the established airways and the approaches to Japan. Their radar provided the clearest picture of KAL 007's initial deviation and its unwavering path towards Soviet airspace. But as we discussed, the most damning part of the Japanese data is the question of what was done with it. They saw the deviation, but issued no warning. Finally, you have the American data. This is, in many ways, the most important and the most secretive piece of the puzzle. The US had powerful military radar installations in Alaska and along the Aleutian Island chain, bases that existed for the sole purpose of peering deep into the Soviet Union. And it's here, in the American data, that some of the most profound controversies arise. The official story, for instance, states that KAL 007 and the RC-135 spy plane came no closer than 75 miles to each other, but some independent researchers who claim to have analyzed raw Alaskan radar data have disputed this, suggesting the two aircraft's radar blips came much closer, perhaps even merging into a single target for a period of time. A perfect tactic to confuse the lower-resolution Soviet radar. This is our established fact. The United States, Japan, and the Soviet Union all tracked parts of KAL 007's flight on radar. However, a complete, unified, and fully declassified set of all raw radar data from all of these sources has never been released for independent public analysis. This lack of a complete picture is what fuels the deepest suspicions, and it centers on one specific, lesser-known, and almost mythical piece of evidence: the Shemya radar tapes. Shemya is a tiny remote island at the very end of the Aleutian chain. In 1983, it was home to one of the most powerful and sophisticated radar systems on the planet, a massive phased array radar known as the Cobra Dane. Its job was to monitor Soviet ballistic missile tests, and it was capable of tracking an object the size of a baseball from hundreds of miles away. The Cobra Dane radar at Shemya would have had the clearest, highest fidelity view of the entire KAL 007 incident. It would have seen the plane's initial deviation. It would have tracked its precise relationship to the RC-135. It would have seen the Soviet fighter scramble. It would have seen the missile launch and the 12-minute descent. The Shemya radar tapes are the closest thing to an objective, God's eye view of the entire event, and they remain top secret to this day. For 4 decades, the United States government has refused to declassify and release the full radar data from the Shemya installation. For conspiracy theorists and independent researchers, this is the ultimate smoking gun. The official story is that the data remains classified to protect sensitive intelligence gathering capabilities. But critics argue that the technology from 1983 is now obsolete, and the real reason for the secrecy is that the tapes contain the truth of the spy mission. They believe the Shemya tapes would show the two aircraft flying in deliberate coordination. They might even show other unseen American aircraft in the area, the mission package we've discussed. The refusal to release this data is seen as the cornerstone of the American cover-up. This leads us to a crucial and unanswered question about the most vital piece of physical evidence in this case. If the official story of a simple navigational error is true, why does the most powerful and comprehensive radar record of the event, data held by the United States, remain hidden under a shroud of national security for more than 40 years? What could that data possibly show that would be so damaging to the United States that it requires this level of perpetual secrecy? The classified radar tapes, the missing minutes from the cockpit voice recorder, the haunting whispers of survivors from the Gulag. These are the ghosts of Cal 007. They are the loose threads of a story that can never be neatly tied up. The unanswered questions that ensure the incident never truly ends. But the tragedy did leave behind a more tangible legacy, a profound and lasting impact that quietly touches the lives of every single person who flies today, even as it failed to heal the deep septic wounds of the Cold War. In the aftermath, as the political firestorm raged, the global aviation community was faced with a terrifying and practical problem. How do we prevent this from ever happening again? If the official story was true, then a state-of-the-art aircraft with a veteran crew had become catastrophically lost due to a simple human error. The system that was supposed to prevent this, the inertial navigation system, had failed. The world needed a better, more foolproof way to navigate the skies, and the solution came from an unlikely source: the United States military. Just 2 weeks after the shootdown, President Ronald Reagan made a landmark announcement. He declared that the military's highly classified satellite navigation network, the Global Positioning System or GPS, would be made available for free, for civilian use by anyone in the world, once it was fully operational. This was a monumental decision. At the time, GPS was a secretive military asset designed to allow nuclear submarines to know their precise location, and for guided missiles to hit their targets with pinpoint accuracy. The Cal 007 disaster was the catalyst that pushed this revolutionary technology out of the shadows and into the public domain. This is our established fact. In response to the Cal 007 incident, the U.S. government made its military-controlled global positioning system available for civilian aviation. This act is widely credited with revolutionizing air safety and preventing similar large-scale navigational errors. The advent of civilian GPS changed everything. Unlike the old self-contained INS systems where a single bad input could corrupt the entire journey, GPS provided a constant external and objective verification of an aircraft's position from a network of satellites. A plane could never get that lost again. The legacy of the 269 victims, in a very real and measurable way, is the incredible safety and precision of the navigation systems that guide every flight you take today. But while the technical problem was solved, the human one was not. The tragedy of Cal 07 did not, as some had hoped, shock the superpowers into a new era of dialogue and understanding. Instead, it did the opposite. It poured concrete on the foundations of their mutual hatred and suspicion. It became a permanent scar, a wound that both sides would pick at for the remainder of the Cold War. For the United States and the West, the incident became the ultimate symbol of Soviet barbarity. It was Exhibit A in the case against the evil empire. The image of a passenger jet filled with sleeping families being shot out of the sky by a soulless fighter pilot was a story so simple and morally clear that it became an unshakable truth, justifying a hawkish foreign policy and a massive military buildup for years to come. In the Western narrative, the Soviets were unrepentant murderers and liars. For the Soviet Union and for many in Russia to this day, the story is the exact opposite. The incident is remembered as proof of America's boundless cynicism and aggression. In their narrative, they were the victims of a sophisticated and cruel intelligence operation that deliberately used a civilian airliner as a shield. They were the ones who were provoked, their borders violated, their defenses tested. Their actions in this light were a justified, if tragic, response to an act of war. In the Russian narrative, the Americans were ruthless puppet masters, willing to sacrifice anyone to win the Cold War. These two narratives have never been reconciled. They exist today as parallel, mutually exclusive realities. And this is where a lesser-known, more cynical theory about that great gift of GPS comes into play. The release of the system was not perhaps a purely altruistic act. By making its military technology the global civilian standard, the United States achieved a massive strategic and economic victory. The entire world's transportation and logistics infrastructure, aviation, shipping, and eventually every car and smartphone, became dependent on a system created, owned, and controlled by the Pentagon. It was a masterful stroke of soft power, turning the tragedy of Cal 007 into an opportunity to secure American technological dominance for the next half-century. This brings us to a final challenging question about the incident's legacy. Did the tangible gift of improved aviation safety symbolized by GPS ultimately serve as a convenient way to close the book on the deeper, unresolved moral questions of the tragedy? Did the world gratefully accept a technological solution in exchange for a collective agreement to forget about the terrifying political truths of what really happened on that dark night in 1983?